The heavy pounding rattled the frosted glass panels of my solid oak front door. It was a rhythmic, furious cadence delivered by someone who expected the world to shrink back in fear. I stood in the center of my foyer, feeling the radiant floor heating hum softly beneath my bare feet. I pulled the heavy door open. Nathan stood on the porch, with the collar of his designer coat turned up against the biting Colorado wind. His face was flushed a dark, angry crimson. He drew in a sharp breath with his jaw locked, ready to unleash the tirade he had been rehearsing for the entire 3-hour drive from Denver. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His hostile gaze drifted past my shoulder. The anger melted off his features, replaced by a sudden, paralyzing shock. He stared at the soaring vaulted timber ceilings, the custom floating staircase, and the sweeping multi-million-dollar panoramic view of the high desert plateau visible through the back terrace. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His hand trembled as he pulled his cell phone from his pocket and pressed it against his ear. "Mom, you need to see this." My name is Joanna Sullivan, and I am a 32-year-old senior risk analyst. I spent 4 years secretly subsidizing my husband and his entitled parents, only for them to launch a smear campaign the second I cut off their funding. They thought I ran away with nothing, but they had no idea I was quietly building an untouchable empire. Before I explain exactly how I orchestrated their ultimate financial ruin, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to Sarah Told Stories if you love seeing greedy people get exactly what they deserve. 3 weeks earlier, the only ceiling I had to stare at was a cracked, popcorn-textured rental in the heart of downtown Denver. I sat at my cramped kitchen island with the harsh glow of my laptop screen illuminating a stack of paper bank statements. Nathan claimed to be an entrepreneur. His startup had been in a state of pre-revenue development for 48 months. I funded the entire illusion. My salary paid our rent, bought his tailored suits, and covered the expensive lease for his parents, Valerie and Eugene. That fragile piece shattered the moment my eyes locked onto a peculiar transaction line on the joint savings ledger. Colorado Heritage Auto down payment for $12,500. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I navigated to his recent receipts and pulled up a digital invoice bearing a luxury dealership logo. The primary driver listed on the insurance binder was not Nathan. It was his younger sister, Caitlin. He had drained the emergency fund I built through grueling overtime hours to buy her a status symbol. A cold, clinical clarity washed over me. I assessed the marital asset. It was toxic. I opened the top drawer of the kitchen island and bypassed the standard scissors, reaching for a pair of heavy titanium kitchen shears. I retrieved my wallet and pulled out the Platinum Joint credit card and the authorized user card linked to his business expenses. I placed the cold titanium blade against the plastic. The snap was sharp and definitive. I cut the cards horizontally and vertically, turning the pieces into jagged, useless confetti. I logged into the banking portal and canceled the automated rent payments for his parents. An hour later, the front door unlocked. Nathan strolled into the kitchen, shedding his coat. He stopped near the island, staring at the pile of shredded plastic resting beside the printed bank statements. "What is this?" he demanded, his brow furrowing. "I am adjusting our risk portfolio," I stated, my voice devoid of any inflection. I closed the accounts. The charming entrepreneur vanished, replaced by a defensive cornered debtor. He slammed his hand down on the granite counter, screaming that I was insane and demanding I call the bank to fix it. He expected me to flinch. I did not flinch. Without saying another word, I walked into the bedroom, packed a single duffel bag, placed my silver wedding band on the counter, and walked out into the cold Denver night, leaving him to face the financial avalanche entirely alone. The tires of my vehicle gripped the winding asphalt of Interstate 70 as I left the glowing sprawl of Denver in the rearview mirror. The climb into the Rocky Mountains brought a sharp drop in temperature, and the air slipping through the dashboard vents smelled of frost and pine. I steered away from the main highway, taking a secluded canyon route that vanished from standard navigation grids. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my wheels, winding upward through a dense grove of towering blue spruce until the headlights swept across the sleek modern lines of my hidden sanctuary. The estate stood as a fortress of glass, steel, and reclaimed timber, blending seamlessly into the jagged mountain ridge. I pulled up to the heavy iron gate and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The locking mechanism clicked open, granting me access to a life my husband never knew existed. This property was an off-grid architectural marvel, engineered to be entirely self-sustaining. A sprawling array of solar panels captured the intense high-altitude sunlight, while a deep geothermal system regulated the internal climate. It required zero external utility connections. The design perfectly mirrored my own survival strategy. I generated my own power, and I no longer required a network of unreliable people to keep the lights on. I purchased the estate 6 months ago, anticipating the inevitable collapse of my marriage. Nathan assumed my role as a corporate risk analyst, paid a modest, comfortable salary. He never bothered to read my employment contracts or ask about the structure of my performance bonuses. My job involved identifying catastrophic liabilities for a top-tier renewable energy firm, saving them tens of millions in potential losses. They compensated me accordingly. I funneled those high six-figure payouts directly into a blind Delaware limited liability company, shielding my true net worth from his entitled grasp. Stepping through the front door, I dropped my single duffel bag onto the polished concrete floor. The radiant heating warmed my bare feet, offering a sharp, comforting contrast to the drafty, cramped apartment I had just abandoned. I walked into the sprawling kitchen and ran my hand along the cool edge of the soapstone counter. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided an uninterrupted view of the peaks, bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. The silence up here was profound. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet of a dying relationship, but the serene, liberating stillness of high-altitude air. I poured a glass of filtered water from the tap and drank deeply, feeling the cold liquid wash away the lingering stress of the confrontation. By cutting the financial cord so abruptly, I initiated a controlled demolition of the parasitic ecosystem my husband had built. Parasites do not gracefully accept starvation. When a host detaches, the organism enters a state of frantic survival. I knew Nathan and his parents were currently waking up to a harsh new reality. I carried my encrypted laptop to the living room and sank into a plush leather armchair facing the mountain view. Booting up the machine, I bypassed my personal profiles. Those were deactivated the moment I crossed the city limits. Instead, I accessed a secured burner account specifically created to monitor digital vulnerabilities. I navigated to my mother-in-law public page. Valerie treated the internet like her personal broadcasting network, curating an aesthetic of unearned affluence. Today, that curated perfection was fractured. The digital footprint revealed the immediate fallout of my severed autopay. The property management company handling their upscale tech center lease wasted zero time. An automated eviction warning had been posted to their resident portal. Rather than reviewing their budget or contacting a recruitment agency to find actual employment, Valerie deployed her favorite weapon. She leveraged her perceived victimhood. Valerie and Eugene had spent their entire lives treating optics as currency. Eugene retired a decade too early, preferring the title of a leisurely gentleman over the reality of a working professional. Valerie hosted weekly brunches, casually dropping the name of her son's fake startup to impress women who wore too much jewelry and asked too few questions. They survived on the mirage of wealth, a mirage sustained solely by my unseen labor. Without my direct deposits, their facade was crumbling in real time. The eviction notice was not just a threat to their shelter, it was a fatal blow to their carefully constructed social identity. I scrolled through a rapid succession of hostile status updates. Valerie was furious, painting a picture of an innocent elderly couple, blindsided by a callous daughter-in-law. She drafted a lengthy post detailing how she would never allow her family to be broken by outside interference. One specific sentence caught my attention. She typed out a venomous declaration, boasting that she always reads the fine print and promising her followers she would not let a greedy runaway wife destroy her son. It was a fascinating choice of words. She prided herself on being meticulous, yet she had spent years blindly cashing checks without ever wondering where the funds originated. That particular boast about reading the fine print logged itself into my memory as a perfect psychological blind spot I could exploit later. The posts garnered hundreds of reactions within hours. Aunts, uncles, and distant cousins flooded the comment section, expressing their outrage. I watched the engagement metrics climb. The tone of the comments shifted from generic sympathy to actionable hostility. Eugene chimed in, demanding someone check my previous employer records to see if I had stolen company funds. Caitlin, fresh off the thrill of receiving a stolen luxury SUV, posted a tearful video claiming I had always been jealous of their tight-knit family dynamic. They were not just venting their frustrations into the digital void, they were crowdsourcing a social hunt. The realization settled over me with a cold, calculating weight. Nathan had clearly informed them that I vanished, leaving behind a shredded credit card and a locked-out banking portal. They lacked the resources to hire private investigators, so they mobilized an army of flying monkeys to scour the internet for any trace of my location. They needed their cash flow restored. Risk analysis teaches you that humans are the most volatile variables in any system. When deprived of their expected resources, people bypass logic and default to emotional retaliation. I watched Valerie upload a photo of Nathan looking despondent on their rented balcony. The caption urged anyone with information regarding my whereabouts to step forward, framing my departure as a sudden mental breakdown. As I read through the escalating comments, I noted how quickly the narrative mutated. Neighbors who previously complimented my quiet demeanor were now speculating that I had embezzled money from Nathan's non-existent business. Former college friends of Nathan suggested contacting the authorities to freeze my assets entirely, unaware that the assets were mine to begin with. The sheer velocity of the misinformation was breathtaking. They were constructing an alternative reality where I was the villain, ensuring that anyone who crossed my path would view me with immediate suspicion. Sitting in the pristine silence of my living room, I leaned back and folded my hands. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I felt the steady hum of a trap being set. By forcing them into a corner, I guaranteed they would act on impulse. They were broadcasting their every move, laying out their entire strategy on a public forum for me to study. Their sheer arrogance made them predictable. They wanted to drag me back to Denver to resume my role as their compliant financier. Instead, they were handing me the exact digital evidence I needed to build a flawless defense. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, casting the room back into the soft glow of the moonlight. The social hunt was officially underway. They were casting a wide net, desperate to drag me back into their sinking ship. But a net only works if the prey is swimming in familiar waters. I had elevated myself to a different altitude entirely. They were looking for a terrified administrative worker on the run. They had no idea they were tracking a predator who had just claimed the high ground, ready to watch their public smear campaign ignite the very fire that would burn their empire to ash. The morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting long golden shadows across the frost-covered timber of my expansive deck. I stepped outside, holding a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast organic coffee. The high-altitude air was sharp and bracing, carrying the distinct scent of pine needles and damp earth. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter warmth spread through my chest. Below me, the canyon stretched out in undisturbed serenity. It was a profound isolation engineered by design. While my physical environment remained entirely tranquil, the digital world I left behind was currently burning to the ground. I set my mug on the cedar railing and opened my secure laptop. The burner account I established the previous night hummed with a fresh barrage of notifications. Valerie had not spent the evening packing her belongings or searching for affordable housing. Instead, she launched a highly coordinated digital smear campaign. Her public timeline read like a masterclass in weaponized victimhood. She posted a lengthy, tear-stained narrative detailing how her seemingly perfect daughter-in-law had suffered a sudden, tragic mental breakdown. According to her fabricated timeline, I had drained Nathan's hard-earned business capital, abandoned my marriage, and left two fragile senior citizens facing imminent homelessness. The narrative was breathtaking in its sheer audacity. Valerie painted me as a ruthless gold digger who had preyed upon her brilliant entrepreneurial son. She claimed I harbored deep-seated psychological instability and had finally snapped, running off with a secret lover funded by their stolen family savings. She attached curated photographs of Eugene looking tired and downtrodden, standing outside their upscale apartment complex. The caption pleaded for community support, framing their impending eviction not as the result of financial parasitism, but as the cruel aftermath of my sudden desertion. The social response was immediate and devastating. The digital wildfire consumed my entire social circle within a matter of hours. I watched the notifications roll in, tracking the rapid collapse of friendships I had nurtured for nearly a decade. Women who stood beside me as bridesmaids left scathing comments under Valerie's post, calling me a heartless monster. Former college roommates shared the fabricated story, demanding that the authorities investigate me for elder abuse. Even distant colleagues from my previous corporate firm chimed in, speculating that my risk analysis career was merely a front for high-level embezzlement. The speed of the ostracization was a fascinating sociological study. People crave a villain to validate their own moral superiority. My sudden silence provided a blank canvas, and Valerie handed them the paint. They eagerly swallowed the lie because it was far more entertaining than the mundane truth of a woman simply refusing to pay her in-laws' rent. My phone, which I had securely powered down and stored in a Faraday bag the night before, was likely overflowing with hateful voicemails and vicious text messages. I was instantly exiled from the community I had subsidized for years. Any other woman might have shattered under the weight of such intense public hatred. A normal person would have logged into their accounts, frantically typing out desperate defenses, uploading bank statements to prove their innocence, and begging for their reputation to be restored. I did not type a single word in my defense. I took another unhurried sip of my coffee, watching a hawk circle the canyon drafts. In my profession, panic is a fatal flaw. When assessing corporate liabilities, you learn that documented public malice is a highly valuable asset. By taking their hostility to a public forum, Valerie and Eugene were doing my legal legwork for free. They were actively generating a pristine, unalterable paper trail of defamation and harassment. I set my coffee down and engaged my screen capture software. I meticulously archived every single defamatory post, every vicious comment from a mutual friend, and every threat veiled as concern. I organized the screenshots into a secure, encrypted digital dossier labeled with the date and timestamps. I cross-referenced the individuals sharing the posts, mapping out the exact network of enablers Nathan relied upon. They believed they were destroying my credibility. In reality, they were handing me the exact ammunition required to demonstrate profound hostile intent during future divorce proceedings. I categorized my former friends as neutralized liabilities, severing my emotional attachment to them with the same clinical precision I used to cut my credit cards. As the morning stretched into the early afternoon, the digital activity began to shift. The public shaming had not produced the desired result. I had not rushed back to Denver begging for forgiveness and carrying a checkbook. My silence infuriated Nathan. Deprived of his primary financial host and facing the crushing reality of his own ineptitude, he transitioned from playing the wounded husband to executing an active hunt. Through the metadata left on the shared accounts I had systematically dismantled, I noticed a strange ping. Nathan lacked the technical sophistication to track me himself. He possessed the ego of an innovator, but none of the actual skills. However, he possessed enough desperation to hire a bottom-feeder private investigator. This operative utilized a simple vulnerability. When I canceled the automatic payments, I briefly accessed a shared cloud portal connected to our old residential lease. The investigator snagged the fragmented IP address from that fleeting login session. It was a faint digital breadcrumb, but it was enough to point a compass toward the high desert plateaus of the Rockies. I monitored the trace route as it bounced through the local servers, pinpointing the geographic location of my canyon sanctuary. I could have deployed a secondary firewall to scramble the location data. I chose to leave the pathway open. A trap requires bait, and I needed Nathan to see the true scale of his failure. The sun began its descent behind the western peaks, casting long, cold shadows across the gravel driveway. The serene silence of the alpine air was abruptly pierced by the crunch of heavy tires navigating the steep incline. A dusty sedan pulled up to the heavy iron gate. The security cameras transmitted the feed directly to my monitors. Nathan stepped out of the vehicle. His designer coat was wrinkled, his hair disheveled from the frantic drive up the mountain pass. He punched the intercom button, his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. I engaged the gate release, allowing the heavy iron doors to swing inward. He drove up the final stretch, parking haphazardly near the entrance. The timeline merged, bringing me straight to the heavy pounding that rattled the frosted glass panels of my solid oak door. I stood in the foyer, feeling the radiant heat beneath my feet, and pulled the heavy door open. Nathan stood on the porch, his chest heaving. He drew a sharp breath, ready to unleash the furious tirade fueled by his mother's viral victimhood campaign. He intended to scream at me for the frozen accounts, the shredded cards, and the sheer audacity of my departure. He opened his mouth, but the sound died instantly in his throat. His hostile gaze drifted past my shoulder. The righteous anger melted off his features, replaced by a sudden, paralyzing shock. He stared at the soaring, vaulted timber ceilings, the custom floating staircase, and the sweeping panoramic view of the mountains visible through the expansive back terrace. He took in the smart glass windows, the slate fireplace, and the sheer, undeniable wealth radiating from every square inch of the architecture. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He realized in a fraction of a second that the woman he treated as a disposable bank account had quietly constructed a breathtaking empire right under his nose. The cramped apartment in Denver was merely a holding cell I tolerated while building a kingdom. His hand trembled as he pulled his cell phone from his coat pocket. He pressed it against his ear, his eyes darting hungrily across the expensive finishes of the foyer. His voice dropped to a hollow, breathless stammer. "Mom, you need to see this." The transformation in his posture was instantaneous and chilling. The frantic, panicked husband seeking to drag his wife back to a mediocre life vanished. As he stared at the multi-million-dollar estate, his desperation morphed into an intense, predatory greed. He was no longer interested in forcing me to pay his parents' rent. He wanted the entire castle. The gears in his mind began turning, calculating how a court might view this hidden sanctuary. He mistakenly believed that because we shared a marriage certificate, he held a rightful claim to the stone and timber surrounding him. He intended to steal the off-grid fortress I had meticulously built, and he would stop at nothing to take the keys. Nathan did not stay on the porch to argue. The sight of the soaring timber ceilings and the sweeping mountain vistas had entirely short-circuited his rehearsed outrage. He simply lowered his cell phone, turned on his heel, and walked back to his vehicle in a stunned silence. I locked the heavy oak door behind him, fully aware that his retreat was not a surrender. It was a tactical withdrawal. I had exposed my fortress, and a man driven by sheer entitlement does not walk away from a castle. He finds a battering ram. 72 hours later, the retaliation arrived in a manila envelope. A private process server navigated the winding canyon road and buzzed my security gate, holding a thick stack of expedited legal filings. I authorized the delivery, retrieving the documents from the exterior Dropbox. The crisp white pages detailed a formal petition for dissolution of marriage, accompanied by an emergency financial injunction. Nathan had hired a notorious local litigator named Lawson, a man whose reputation in the Denver family court circuit relied on theatrical aggression rather than legal nuance. Reading through the petition felt like reviewing a poorly constructed fiction novel. Lawson had drafted a narrative depicting Nathan as a devoted, supportive spouse who sacrificed his own entrepreneurial ambitions to nurture my corporate career. The documents claimed the Alpine estate was purchased using commingled marital funds and demanded a 50% equity split. Furthermore, Nathan requested an exorbitant monthly spousal support stipend, citing profound emotional trauma and a sudden loss of established living standards. He wanted to force the sale of my off-grid sanctuary to fund the very lifestyle I had just dismantled. I did not experience a single flutter of panic. In risk management, a predictable threat is a manageable threat. Nathan was operating exactly as my models projected. The following morning, I drove down the mountain into the heart of the downtown financial district. My legal counsel, Victoria, occupied a corner office in a towering glass high-rise. Victoria was a veteran corporate litigator who transitioned into high-asset divorce law. She possessed a mind like a steel trap and a demeanor that left opposing counsel sweating through their tailored suits. I handed her the injunction, sliding the thick stack of paper across her polished mahogany desk. Victoria scanned the document, her eyes darting across the paragraphs with predatory speed. She let out a dry, humorless laugh, tossing the pages back onto the desk. "Lawson is fishing in shallow water," she stated, leaning back in her leather chair. "He is throwing every standard grievance at the wall, hoping something sticks. We can crush this injunction by noon. I can file a countermotion demonstrating that you purchased the property using an isolated performance bonus secured through a discreet corporate channel. We can prove he contributed zero capital." I shook my head slowly, resting my hands on the cool glass surface of the table. "We are not going to crush it, Victoria. We are going to let him believe he has me cornered." Victoria narrowed her eyes, studying my face. She recognized the specific, cold calculation in my tone. "You want to bait him," she deduced. "If we obliterate his claim today, he will realize he is outmatched," I explained, keeping my voice level and precise. "He will regroup, hire a better forensic accountant, and start digging into the deeper layers of my financial history. He is currently fixated on the physical house because it is the largest asset he can comprehend. I need his focus narrowed entirely on that single property. If he believes the real estate is my only valuable holding, he will stop searching for the rest of my capital." Victoria tapped a silver pen against her palm, a slow smile spreading across her face. "You want to play the terrified victim," she murmured. "You want him to feel superior." "I need him to feel invincible," I corrected. "An invincible enemy ignores their own blind spots." We scheduled a preliminary mediation session via video conference for the end of the week. Lawson insisted on a virtual meeting, attempting to assert dominance by controlling the digital environment. I spent the morning of the mediation carefully curating my physical appearance. I bypassed the sharp-tailored blazers I typically wore to executive board meetings. Instead, I pulled a faded, oversized gray sweater from the back of my closet. I washed my face, leaving my skin bare and slightly pale. I tied my hair into a messy, uneven knot, allowing stray strands to fall haphazardly around my jawline. I set up my laptop in the smallest, most unremarkable corner of a spare guest bedroom. I angled the camera to capture a blank beige wall, deliberately hiding the custom stone fireplace and the sweeping mountain views. I needed to project the aesthetic of a woman whose world was collapsing. When the video feed connected, Lawson filled the screen, sitting in a plush leather office chair. Nathan sat beside him, radiating an unearned, arrogant confidence. He wore a crisp, blue button-down shirt, his posture relaxed and expansive. He looked at my diminished appearance through the monitor, and a faint, satisfied sneer touched the corner of his mouth. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," Lawson began, his voice booming through my computer speakers with practiced theatricality. "My client is legally entitled to half of the marital estate. We have reviewed the property records for the Colorado Canyon residence. However, we have reason to believe your client is engaging in malicious financial concealment." Victoria sat in her own office feed, projecting calm neutrality. "Please clarify your accusation, counselor." Lawson leaned forward, adjusting his tie, like a prosecutor delivering a fatal blow. "My private investigator unearthed the secure digital routing number tied to your client. It points directly to a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands. We know she is funneling marital assets into a tax haven. We demand immediate, unrestricted access to the Cayman ledger, or we will petition the judge for a full federal audit." The trap was sprung. Nathan sat back, crossing his arms, waiting for me to shatter. He thought he had uncovered my ultimate secret. He thought he had found the treasure chest. I allowed my breath to hitch audibly. I lowered my gaze to the keyboard, letting my shoulders slump forward inside the baggy sweater. My hands trembled slightly as I reached up to push a stray piece of hair behind my ear. I projected pure, unadulterated panic. "You cannot do that," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "Please, that account is private." Lawson smiled a wide, predatory grin. "Transparency is mandatory in a dissolution of marriage, Mrs. Sullivan. Provide the login credentials immediately." Victoria sighed, playing her part flawlessly. "Joanna, if the account exists, you must disclose it." I hesitated, biting my lower lip. With shaking fingers, I typed the banking credentials into the secure chat box. Lawson snatched his mouse, eagerly navigating to the offshore portal. The silence on the call stretched for 30 agonizing seconds as the opposing attorney logged into the Cayman Islands database. I watched the exact moment the illusion evaporated. Lawson's triumphant grin faltered, his brow furrowed in profound confusion. He clicked his mouse rapidly, refreshing the page, as if the digital interface had made a mathematical error. Nathan leaned closer to the screen, his arrogant posture stiffening. "There is $350 in this account," Lawson stated, his booming voice reduced to a flat, confused monotone. I looked up into the camera, my eyes wide and pleading. "It is a specialized streaming service," I explained, my voice barely above a whisper. "They produce highly specific European documentaries on grid failures and renewable energy infrastructure. The platform requires a regional banking proxy to process the subscription fees. I use it for my corporate risk research. It is just $350. Nathan's face flushed a deep, furious red. The grand offshore conspiracy, the hidden millions he expected to seize, had just dissolved into a generic television subscription. He had deployed an expensive private investigator to uncover a streaming bill. The true beauty of the red herring lay in its simplicity. While Nathan and Lawson burned their resources hunting down a decoy account in the Caribbean, my actual liquid wealth, measuring in the high seven figures, sat heavily insulated within a domestic Delaware limited liability company. It was completely legal, entirely untraceable, and hidden in plain sight. By offering them a tiny, inconsequential victory, I satisfied their investigative itch and successfully steered them away from the actual vault. Lawson cleared his throat, attempting to recover his lost momentum. "The overseas account is irrelevant," he declared, waving a dismissive hand. "The primary focus remains the physical real estate. The mountain property holds a current market valuation exceeding $3 million. My client demands an immediate forced liquidation of the asset to fulfill his rightful equity share." I leaned closer to the webcam, clutching the collar of my faded sweater. "Please, Nathan," I begged, letting a single manufactured tear gather in the corner of my eye. "You already took the savings. Do not take my home. I have nowhere else to go." Nathan looked at the screen, soaking in my fabricated desperation. The humiliation of the Cayman account failure vanished, replaced by the intoxicating thrill of holding my future in his hands. He flashed a smug, victorious smirk directly into the camera. It was the chilling expression of a man who believed he had successfully cornered his prey. "We are forcing the sale," Joanna Nathan stated, his voice dripping with condescension. "You should start packing those cheap sweaters." The mediation concluded shortly after. The video feeds clicked off, plunging my spare bedroom back into silence. I sat perfectly still for a moment, letting the terrified persona melt away. I straightened my spine and closed the laptop. Nathan believed he had won the battle for the estate. He believed my entire net worth was tied up in the timber and stone of the Canyon house. But greedy men lack patience. Tying up a physical property in a contentious divorce court can take several months of grueling litigation. Nathan was currently drowning in debt, trying to maintain his mother's lifestyle while funding his own illusions. He needed cash immediately, and a lengthy legal battle would starve him out. I walked into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of iced water. I knew Nathan would not wait for a judge to force the sale of the house. He needed a faster way to break me, to force a rapid cash settlement. To achieve that, he would have to target the only remaining pillar of my stability. He would have to destroy my professional reputation. He was preparing to sever my income source entirely, unaware that he was about to hand me the exact weapon required to obliterate his entire digital existence. The morning commute down the mountain always offered a quiet buffer between my sanctuary and the relentless pace of downtown Denver. I parked in the subterranean garage of the energy firm, gripping my leather briefcase. My career was the singular, stable pillar of my existence. I spent my 20s skipping vacations and working 80-hour weeks to climb the corporate ladder. Earning the title of senior risk analyst was not just a professional achievement, it was my identity. I swiped my security badge at the primary turnstile. A harsh red light blinked on the scanner. The glass barriers remained sealed. I stepped back frowning and swiped the card a second time. The same red light illuminated the terminal. A security guard approached, asking me to step aside. He avoided making eye contact. He informed me that my access credentials had been temporarily suspended and escorted me to a private elevator reserved for executive discipline. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. The doors opened on the top floor. The Director of Human Resources stood waiting alongside the Chief Executive Officer. Their expressions were grim, unreadable masks. They ushered me into a sprawling corner office overlooking the city skyline. I took a seat in a rigid leather chair. For the first time since this ordeal began, my hands began to shake. Real fear, cold and suffocating, gripped my chest. Nathan was trying to sever the very lifeline that kept me breathing. The CEO slid a thick manila folder across the polished desk. "We received an anonymous tip late last night," he explained, his voice tight with concern. "The sender blind copied the entire executive board and the internal auditing division. The email contains a series of vendor invoices and routing authorizations that appear to bypass our standard oversight protocols." I opened the folder. The documents were printed in high resolution. My eyes scanned the spreadsheets and the doctored signatures. The anonymous sender had meticulously crafted a narrative suggesting I funneled corporate funds into a ghost entity. The fabricated ledger implied I stole hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase my off-grid mountain estate. The forger even included fake email threads where I supposedly negotiated kickbacks with renewable energy suppliers. The penalty for corporate embezzlement is not just immediate termination. It means federal prison. It meant losing my license, my reputation, and my freedom. "We have to place you on a 48-hour administrative leave," the HR director stated softly. "The firm must conduct an independent audit. You understand, we cannot take risks with investor capital, Joanna. If these documents hold up to scrutiny, we will have no choice but to involve the authorities." I stared at the pages. The panic threatening to overwhelm me suddenly receded, replaced by a sharp, analytical focus. I looked closely at the formatting of the supposed vendor invoices. The margins were misaligned. The font on the routing numbers did not match the company standard typeface. More importantly, the anonymous sender used a phrasing structure I recognized intimately. The email summarized the theft using the exact buzzwords Nathan loved to throw around during his fake startup pitches. He always used the term synergy matrices and leveraged capital injections. Those terms were sitting right there in the accusation letter. "My husband is trying to destroy me," I said, looking up from the folder. "We are in the middle of a contentious divorce. He wants to force a cash settlement by ruining my income." The CEO sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I want to believe you, Joanna. Your track record here is flawless, but we cannot ignore a detailed whistleblower complaint based on a domestic dispute. The evidence needs verification." "Do not verify the spreadsheets I instructed," keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "Verify the sender. Bring your Chief Information Security Officer into this room right now. If a legitimate whistleblower sent this, they would use an encrypted Proton mail server or a virtual private network. A man driven by blind entitlement and unearned confidence will overlook the basic architecture of Internet routing." The CEO hesitated, weighing the risk. He picked up his desk phone and dialed the security department. Less than 5 minutes later, the head of cybersecurity walked into the office carrying a sleek silver laptop. He connected to the internal network and pulled up the raw data from the anonymous email. "I need you to trace the originating Internet protocol address I requested." Gripping the armrests of my chair, "Check the packet headers. Do not just look at the masked email domain, look at the physical origin of the transmission." The security officer typed a series of commands into his terminal. The room fell silent save for the rapid clicking of his keyboard. Lines of green code scrolled across his dark screen as the tracking software peeled back the digital layers of the anonymous message. Nathan thought creating a fake Gmail account rendered him invisible. He failed to understand that every single keystroke leaves a forensic footprint. The tracking program locked onto a target. The security officer turned his laptop toward the desk. "The email did not originate from a secure offshore server," he reported, adjusting his glasses. "The packet data traces straight back to a residential internet service provider. The physical address is a luxury apartment complex in the Denver Tech Center." He read the exact street address aloud. It was the specific apartment building where Valerie and Eugene lived. the same apartment where Nathan had been sleeping on the couch since our separation. The CEO exhaled a long, heavy breath. He looked at the HR director and then back to me. The tension in the room dissipated instantly. The realization that their top risk analyst was the victim of a clumsy, malicious domestic attack shifted the dynamic. They recognized the severe liability of acting on a fabricated tip. "Your suspension is lifted, effective immediately," the CEO declared, sliding the manila folder into the trash can beside his desk. "I apologize for the distress, Joanna. Our legal department will handle the internal documentation to clear your name." I stood up, my hands perfectly still. "I do not need your legal department to handle this," I replied, gathering my coat. "I have my own representation, and my husband just handed us the keys to his entire life." I left the high-rise and dialed Victoria the moment I stepped onto the pavement. I relayed the events of the morning, detailing the traced IP address and the fabricated vendor documents. Victoria let out a sharp, triumphant laugh through the receiver. "He crossed the line from civil disagreement to cyber-stalking and corporate sabotage," she said, her tone shifting into a predatory cadence. "Filing a false police report or attempting to ruin your employment with fabricated evidence is a fierce escalation. I am calling the family court judge before lunch. We are filing an emergency motion for a discovery subpoena." "What does that give us?" I asked, slipping into the driver's seat of my car. "It gives us everything Victoria promised. Because he used electronic means to perpetrate a targeted attack on your livelihood, the court will grant us full access to his digital ecosystem. I can subpoena his hard drives, his cloud storage, his cell phone records, and his personal banking history. We get to crack him open and look at every single secret he is hiding." The drive back up the mountain felt different. The crisp afternoon sun illuminated the winding canyon roads, reflecting off the patches of melting snow. Nathan had tried to orchestrate my ruin because he lacked the patience to wait for a mediation settlement. He wanted a swift victory. He assumed striking my career would leave me desperate and compliant. Instead, his reckless escalation provided the exact legal leverage I needed to bypass his privacy shields. I arrived at the off-grid estate as the evening shadows began to stretch across the timber deck. I locked the heavy doors behind me, retreating into the pristine silence of my sanctuary. I brewed a cup of black tea and walked into my home office. I possessed a specialized suite of decryption software, a professional-grade toolkit I utilized when tearing down corrupted energy grids and investigating phantom liabilities. I booted up my primary workstation, connecting it to a secure, encrypted tunnel. Within hours, Victoria sent the authorized subpoenas directly to Nathan internet service providers and cloud hosting platforms. The court order compelled them to release the raw data caches. My screen illuminated with incoming file transfers. I was staring at the unvarnished reality of my estranged husband. He spent 4 years parading around as a misunderstood genius, demanding my financial support while contributing nothing to our household. I cracked my knuckles and began sorting through the endless rows of data directories. I was going to dissect his fake startup. I intended to audit every single email, every deleted text message, and every hidden transaction. He brought a clumsy forged document to a corporate knife fight. Now I held the scalpel, and I prepared to cut away the illusions, exposing the dark, hollow core of his existence. The high-altitude air pressed against the smart glass windows of my mountain sanctuary. Inside, the temperature remained perfectly regulated by the geothermal system, but a chilling realization settled deep in my chest. I sat before the curved monitors in my home office. The subpoenaed data caches from Victoria had finished downloading. Risk analysis is not a mystical art. It is the disciplined application of mathematics and pattern recognition. I opened the primary drive cloned from Nathan Cloud servers. For years, he guarded his laptop with intense paranoia, claiming his startup proprietary code required strict compartmentalization. The folders displayed on my screen contained zero code. There were no pitch decks or investor profiles. I routed his banking history through a proprietary algorithmic filter designed to catch hidden liabilities. The program flagged a recurring alphanumeric string tied to an offshore routing number. I traced the pathway, finding a hidden directory labeled with a generic numerical code. I decrypted the file using standard brute force software. Nathan possessed the ego of an innovator, but utilized the password security of a careless teenager. The document loaded, illuminating my face in a wash of stark white light. It was a master promissory note. The lender was an unregulated private equity syndicate operating in the shadows of the financial sector. The principal amount sat at $1.2 million. My eyes drifted to the terms. A glowing red font on his internal tracking spreadsheet indicated a 25% compounding interest rate. He was drowning in toxic debt. I needed to understand how a man without a verifiable income managed to burn through 7 figures. I accessed his brokerage history, expecting to find a string of failed venture capital investments or standard sports betting losses. Instead, I found a highly concentrated series of market positions. He had executed hundreds of rapid trades over a 2-year period. I cross-referenced the stock ticker symbols, and the breath hitched in my throat. He did not lose the money betting on random startups. He funneled the syndicate capital into relentless short positions against my own employer. The betrayal struck with surgical precision. My husband, the man who slept next to me and accepted my financial support, had actively wagered against my success. Shorting a stock means profiting only when the asset loses value. He needed my renewable energy firm to fail so his wagers would pay out. If my company collapsed, I would lose my career and my performance bonuses, rendering me entirely dependent upon him. It was a calculated strategy of financial gain and psychological control. He bet against the very career that kept a roof over his head and paid his parents' rent. Syndicate lenders do not distribute million-dollar loans based on a smile and a speculative trading strategy. They demand hard, tangible collateral. I opened the annex of the promissory note to view the guarantor schedules. Nathan owned 0 equity, yet the document listed the Colorado estate and his parents' longtime Denver residence as secured assets. I scrutinized the digital signature certificates to uncover the mechanics of the fraud. He utilized a corrupt digital notary operating within his inner gambling circle. The system logs showed the digital contracts were signed using spoofed Internet Protocol addresses. He engineered the location data to mimic my previous downtown apartment and his parents' current address. He forged our signatures, binding our homes to his catastrophic failures. He offered up the roof over his own parents' heads to finance his delusion. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, letting the glow of the monitors reflect in the dark windows. A distinct memory surfaced from my early days as a junior analyst. I was sitting in a sterile boardroom across from my first corporate mentor, a seasoned veteran of hostile liquidations. We were reviewing a corrupted tech firm bleeding cash. I had suggested launching a direct legal assault to seize their assets. My mentor shook his head, tapping his pen against the ledger. He looked at me with pristine clarity and delivered a lesson I never forgot. He told me to never fight a drowning man. The panic makes them unpredictable, and they will pull you under the surface with them. He advised me to just hand the man an anvil and let his own weight finish the job. That advice resonated with terrifying perfection. If I exposed the forgery today, Nathan would panic. He might flee the jurisdiction or attempt a destructive legal maneuver that could tie up my assets in a protracted criminal investigation. I needed him insulated, confident, and highly motivated to take ownership of my Delaware holding company. I needed to hand him the anvil disguised as a golden parachute. A sudden chime interrupted my thoughts. I kept an active security feed linked to my former downtown Denver rental. I had intentionally left the exterior doorbell camera active, routing the signal through an encrypted proxy. I switched my secondary monitor to the live feed. The grainy night vision footage displayed the narrow hallway outside the apartment door. 2 men in heavy dark coats stood in the corridor. They did not look like standard process servers or confused delivery drivers. They carried themselves with the rigid, alert posture of professional enforcers. One of them leaned close to the door, inspecting the lock, while the other scanned the hallway. The syndicate was no longer waiting for a digital transfer. The underground debt collectors were hunting for the man who signed away his family homes. If the enforcers found Nathan before I finalized the divorce settlement, the entire snare would shatter. A man with broken legs cannot sign a binding legal contract. He needed to remain blissfully unaware of the physical threat closing in on his location. I checked the timestamps on the security feed. They were knocking on the door of the apartment I abandoned weeks ago. They did not know he was currently sleeping on his parents' couch in the tech center. My phone vibrated on the desk, pulling my attention away from the chilling security footage. The screen displayed an incoming message from Victoria. She forwarded an email from Nathan, attorney. The message indicated that Nathan was preparing a revised settlement demand and intended to gather specific evidence to prove my financial instability. I smiled, a cold, calculated expression that held no warmth. The pieces were moving exactly as I predicted. I closed the security feed and walked toward the expansive kitchen facing the canyon. I poured a glass of filtered water, staring out into the dense pine forest. The gravel crunching on the distant, winding road caught my attention. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, making a steady climb toward my security gates. Nathan lacked the courage to confront me alone again, but he desperately needed the promised evidence to execute his legal strategy. He had deployed an emissary to breach my walls. I set my glass on the soapstone counter and prepared to welcome the intruder. I sat in the cool blue glow of my multi-monitor setup, tracking the terrifying breadth of the syndicate debt. The private equity enforcers were no longer abstract threats hiding within digital spreadsheets. My security feeds captured unidentified dark vehicles circling my former Denver address. The underground debt collectors were actively hunting for the man who signed away his family homes. If they found Nathan before I finalized the divorce settlement, the entire snare would shatter. I needed him insulated, confident, and highly motivated to take ownership of my Delaware holding company. He needed to believe he was stealing a treasure chest rather than a live grenade. The perimeter chime of my security system interrupted my forensic analysis. I pulled up the gate camera feed. A pristine white luxury SUV idled on the gravel driveway. It was the exact vehicle purchased with my depleted savings just weeks ago. Caitlin stepped out into the crisp mountain air, pulling her tailored wool coat tight against the wind. She pressed the intercom button, staring into the lens with wide, manufactured innocence. Caitlin spent her entire life coasting on the unearned privileges provided by her parents and her older brother. While I worked 80-hour weeks running risk models, she cultivated a social media following and complained about the exhaustion of finding the perfect matcha latte. She viewed me not as an equal, but as a deep-pocketed utility. Her arrival at my off-grid sanctuary was no coincidence. With the legal battle stalling and Nathan growing desperate, Valerie had clearly dispatched her golden child to gather intelligence. I pressed the release button, allowing the heavy iron gates to swing inward. I met her at the front door wearing a plain gray cardigan over a simple white shirt, projecting the image of an exhausted, retreating woman. Caitlin rushed forward, throwing her arms around my shoulders in a stiff, theatrical embrace. She smelled of expensive floral perfume and underlying desperation. "Joanna, I am so sorry about everything," Caitlin murmured, stepping into the foyer and scanning the vaulted timber ceilings with poorly concealed envy. "Nathan and my mother are losing their minds. I told them they were pushing you too hard. I just wanted to check on you. This divorce is destroying our family." I guided her into the living room, gesturing toward the plush leather sofa. She sat down, placing her oversized designer purse carefully on the glass coffee table. The clasp was slightly ajar. As I turned toward the kitchen to retrieve glasses, my trained eyes caught a faint rhythmic pulse. Deep within the shadows of her leather bag, a tiny red LED light blinked steadily. She was wearing a wire. More accurately, she was utilizing a digital recording application on her phone, hoping to bait me into a volatile confession. In many jurisdictions, secretly recording a conversation constitutes a felony. However, Colorado operates under a one-party consent statute. As long as Caitlin was an active participant in the dialogue, she possessed the legal right to document every word. I did not fear the authorities. I saw a brilliant tactical opportunity. A risk analyst understands that misinformation is a highly effective defensive measure. Caitlin wanted to capture a vindictive wife hiding millions in marital assets. I decided to hand her a spectacular tragedy instead. I uncorked a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir, pouring the dark ruby liquid into 2 crystal glasses. I walked back to the living room, handing her a glass with a deliberate, slight tremor in my fingers. I sat in the armchair opposite her, wrapping both hands around my wine. I let my shoulders slump, exhaling a long, ragged breath. "I appreciate you coming, Caitlin," I said, forcing my voice to waver, keeping my gaze fixed on the floor. "I have not slept in days. The lawyers are draining my checking accounts, and Nathan is demanding half of this estate." Caitlin leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. "He just wants what is fair, Joanna. But this house is incredible. You must have spent a fortune building this off-grid setup. It looks like a billionaire retreat." I let out a hollow, bitter laugh, burying my face in my hands. I produced a perfectly timed sob, allowing a single tear to escape and track down my cheek. "It is a disaster," I whispered, looking up at her with wide, terrified eyes. "I made a terrible mistake. I funneled my entire corporate bonus into a blind holding company to buy this land, but the construction costs spiraled out of control. The solar arrays and the geothermal drilling required specialized contractors." I leaned closer to the coffee table, ensuring the hidden microphone captured every single syllable of my fabricated ruin. "I took out a predatory construction loan using the holding company. The interest rates are suffocating me. The mortgage is entirely underwater. If Nathan forces a property appraisal during the divorce discovery, the creditors will realize I am insolvent. They are going to foreclose on this house by the end of the month. I am facing total bankruptcy, Caitlin. If Nathan takes the holding company, he is going to inherit a mountain of toxic debt." Caitlin took a slow sip of her wine, trying to mask the triumphant smirk spreading across her face. She believed she had just unearthed the ultimate secret. In her mind, I was a fraudulent failure, a woman who tried to build an isolated castle only to bury herself in a financial grave. She offered a few hollow platitudes, patting my hand with fake sympathy. She promised to keep my dire situation a secret between us, assuring me she would talk sense into her brother. 20 minutes later, she practically sprinted out the front door, eager to deliver the recorded gold mine to her family. I stood on the porch, watching the white SUV disappear down the winding canyon road. The tears vanished instantly. I took a sip of my wine, the rich, complex flavors settling smoothly on my palate. The strategic misinformation detonated exactly as planned. Less than 48 hours after Caitlin departed, my legal counsel Victoria received an urgent, revised settlement demand from Nathan and his attorney. Armed with the illicit audio recording, Nathan radically altered his strategy. He no longer demanded a mere 50% equity split of the physical real estate. He wanted total, undisputed ownership of the Delaware holding company that held the deed to the property. His logic was brilliantly flawed. Based on my tearful confession, Nathan assumed the limited liability company was currently hemorrhaging cash and facing imminent foreclosure. He intended to seize the corporate entity, restructure the fictitious construction loan using his own supposed entrepreneurial acumen, and flip the property for a staggering profit. He felt immensely powerful, believing he possessed insider knowledge of my impending financial collapse. He wanted to strip the toxic asset from my hands and crown himself the savior of the real estate. He pushed relentlessly, ordering his lawyer to draft an emergency mediation session to finalize the transfer of the corporate entity. He marched blindly toward the negotiating table, eager to rip the deed from my desperate grasp. He had no idea that by demanding total control of the holding company, he was walking directly into the center of the web. He thought he was outsmarting a desperate woman on the verge of ruin. I prepared my tailored suits and reviewed the transfer documents. The snare was primed. It was time to execute the final surrender and hand my husband the very weapon that would secure his undeniable doom. The downtown Denver skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victoria's law firm. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, staring at the polished mahogany conference table. The room smelled of expensive espresso and lemon polish. Today was the final pretrial mediation. My tailored suit felt like a suit of armor, a stark contrast to the vulnerable persona I needed to project. I had instructed Victoria to draft a very specific settlement agreement. She sat beside me, reviewing the final printed pages. Her sharp legal mind recognized the sheer danger of the document she held, but she trusted my risk assessment protocols. "You are handing him the keys to the castle," Joanna, Victoria cautioned, her voice low and steady. "If he accepts this offer, he takes the Delaware holding company and the Alpine estate free and clear. You walk away with a clean divorce decree, but zero equity from that property." "I want him to take the holding company," I replied, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. "The physical real estate is just the shiny lure. The actual hook is buried in the final addendum. Did you include the exact phrasing I requested regarding the liability transfer?" Victoria nodded, tapping a manicured fingernail against the crisp white paper. Section 4 explicitly states that the transferee assumes all known and unknown liabilities associated with the corporate entity and the marriage itself. It legally binds him to every debt, every encumbrance, and every hidden financial crater tied to his name, regardless of when it was incurred. Perfect, I murmured. He believes the holding company is drowning in a predatory construction loan because Caitlin fed him a fabricated story. He thinks he is seizing a distressed asset that he can magically restructure with his non-existent business acumen. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open, interrupting our quiet strategy session. Lawson strutted into the room first, carrying a battered leather briefcase. Nathan followed close behind, wearing a fresh haircut and a smug, self-assured grin. He looked like a man arriving to collect a lottery prize. I felt a surge of cold, clinical satisfaction. Right behind him walked Valerie. Mediation sessions typically exclude extended family members, but Valerie had undoubtedly demanded a front-row seat to witness my downfall. She carried a designer handbag and wore a bright yellow silk scarf, projecting an air of unearned superiority. She took a seat directly across from me, folding her hands on the table with a triumphant gleam in her eyes. Eugene must have stayed home, but Valerie was more than enough to facilitate my snare. "Let us skip the pleasantries," Lawson announced, dropping his briefcase and pulling out a stack of heavily redacted financial demands. "My client is aware of the precarious financial situation surrounding the off-grid property. We know about the underwater construction loans. We also know your client is desperate to unload the burden. Therefore, we are no longer asking for a 50% equity split. My client demands total ownership of the Delaware entity and the property it holds. In exchange, he will waive his request for ongoing spousal support." Victoria played her role flawlessly. She let out a sharp scoff, leaning forward to defend me. "You are demanding a property valued in the millions, Lawson. My client built that sanctuary. We are prepared to take this to trial and force a liquidation before we hand over total ownership." Nathan chuckled, a patronizing sound that echoed in the quiet room. "You do not have the capital for a protracted trial, Joanna. Caitlin told us everything. You are bleeding cash. You took out loans you cannot repay, and the creditors are closing in. If you fight me in court, the banks will foreclose on the house before the judge even issues a ruling. Hand it over now, and I will take the financial mess off your hands." I kept my gaze fixed on the table, allowing my shoulders to slump. I bit my lower lip, channeling the frantic energy of a woman cornered by her own supposed incompetence. "I cannot pay the lawyers to fight you," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I just want this nightmare to end. I want a clean break, Nathan." Lawson smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Then we have a verbal agreement. We will draft the transfer documents this afternoon." Victoria intervened, sliding our prepared contract across the mahogany surface. "We have already drafted the settlement," she stated, her tone brisk and professional. "My client is willing to execute an unconditional surrender of the limited liability company. She will sign over the deed, the solar arrays, and the surrounding acreage. However, if she is walking away, she requires precise indemnification." Lawson picked up the contract, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. He flipped to the 4th page, stopping at the liability clauses. He frowned, his experienced legal instincts sensing a potential trap. "This phrasing is incredibly broad," Lawson noted, tapping his pen against the paper. "The assumption of all known and unknown liabilities tied to the LLC and the marital union. My client is willing to assume the property debt, but taking on unknown marital liabilities is a significant risk." Nathan shifted in his seat, sudden hesitation flickering across his face. "What does that mean, exactly?" Before Lawson could explain the fundamental dangers of assuming unverified debts, Valerie leaned forward. The foreshadowing I had noted weeks ago on her social media timeline materialized right in front of me. She prided herself on being the smartest person in the room, the matriarch who always read the fine print. She snatched the document from Lawson, grasping it with greedy, trembling fingers. "It means she is terrified of the construction loans," Valerie declared, her eyes darting across the paragraphs. "She is trying to make sure you do not sue her for the underwater mortgage after you fix her mess. Look at her, Nathan. She is broke. The holding company is her only asset, and it is poisoned. If you sign this, you get the $3 million house, and she walks away with nothing." Lawson tried to caution them gently, raising a hand. Valerie, we should conduct a thorough audit of the LLC before signing a blanket assumption clause. There could be hidden creditors. There are no hidden creditors, Valerie snapped, dismissing the seasoned attorney with a wave of her hand. Caitlin recorded her confessing to the construction debt. That is the only liability. Do not let this lawyer complicate a simple victory, Nathan. Sign the paper. We take the house today. Nathan looked at his mother, absorbing her toxic confidence. He looked at the contract, envisioning the vaulted ceilings and the high desert views. He saw a trophy he could parade in front of his fake startup investors. He did not see the lethal fine print binding him to his own horrific gambling debts. The syndicate money he owed to a ruthless private equity firm was technically a marital liability incurred during our union. By signing this document, he was explicitly taking sole legal responsibility for that specific debt, shielding me entirely from the fallout. I let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. It was a long, ragged breath that sounded like profound defeat. I reached across the table and pushed the pen toward him. "Just take it," I whispered, staring at my hands. "Take the house and leave me alone." Valerie actually clapped her hands together, a sharp, delighted sound that echoed through the boardroom. She was celebrating her perceived triumph, thrilled to watch me surrender my wealth. Nathan grabbed the pen. He did not hesitate a second longer. He pressed the ink to the signature line and signed his name with a flourishing, arrogant stroke. He flipped to the addendum, initialing the liability assumption clause exactly where Victoria had placed a small yellow sticky note. He handed the document back to my attorney, a victorious sneer plastered across his face. "It is done," Nathan said, standing up and adjusting his jacket. "You can keep your cheap apartment, Joanna. My parents and I are moving into the Canyon estate by the weekend. Do not ever contact us again." Valerie stood up, clutching her designer bag, radiating pure, unearned pride. She looked down at me, treating me like a discarded stepping stone. "We finally got rid of the dead weight," she sneered. "Come on, Nathan. We have a housewarming party to plan." They marched out of the conference room, followed by a bewildered Lawson, who still suspected he had missed a crucial detail. The heavy glass doors clicked shut, sealing their fate. I sat perfectly still for 10 seconds, waiting for the sound of their footsteps to fade down the corridor. Then I lifted my head. The fabricated tears evaporated from my eyes. I straightened my posture, shedding the illusion of the broken wife. Victoria looked at the signed contract, then looked up at me, a fierce grin breaking across her usually stoic face. "He just indemnified you," she confirmed, her voice humming with professional awe. "He formally assumed every single debt connected to his name and the holding company." I stood up, picking up my briefcase. "They think they just stole a multi-million-dollar paradise," I said, my voice cold and crystalline. "They have no idea they just legally volunteered to pay back a ruthless crime syndicate." The bait was swallowed. The hook was set deep in their arrogant jaws. Nathan, Valerie, and Eugene were packing their bags to move into a luxurious, high-altitude fortress, entirely unaware that the walls were rigged with financial explosives. The real game was about to begin, and I held the only detonator. The heavy iron gates of the Canyon Sanctuary swung inward, welcoming its new temporary monarchs. Nathan drove a freshly leased luxury sedan up the winding gravel path, with the tires crunching loudly against the pristine stone. Valerie sat in the passenger seat, peering through the tinted windows with hungry, calculating eyes. Eugene trailed behind in a rented moving truck, hauling whatever meager possessions they managed to salvage from their cramped tech center apartment. They stepped onto the sprawling driveway, treating the high-altitude air like their personal kingdom. Nathan unlocked the solid oak front door, striding into the foyer with unearned swagger. He ran his hands along the custom floating staircase, inflating his chest as if his own architectural genius had constructed the timber beams. Valerie immediately began orchestrating the space. She directed the movers, pointing sharp, manicured fingers toward the expansive living room. The sheer gluttony of their arrival was a spectacle of profound delusion. They did not pause to appreciate the off-grid engineering or the sustainable architecture. They viewed the estate merely as a status symbol representing a trophy they had wrested from a defeated enemy. Nathan carried a bottle of expensive vintage champagne onto the cedar deck. He popped the cork, letting the pressurized foam spill over the railing and onto the frost-covered ground below. He held his phone high, capturing the moment for his digital audience. He posed against the breathtaking backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, broadcasting his fabricated success to every former colleague and jealous rival. He typed captions boasting about his entrepreneurial triumphs and his newly acquired high-altitude lifestyle. The dramatic irony dripped from every pixel of his uploaded photographs. He stood on a patio that technically belonged to a predatory private equity syndicate, smiling for an audience of fools while dancing on a financial landmine. He believed he had captured a castle. He had actually locked himself inside a beautifully decorated cage. Their appetite for luxury proved insatiable. Over the next 48 hours, the in-laws transformed the estate into a monument of reckless consumption. Valerie deemed my previous decor too minimalist for her tastes. She contacted high-end interior design firms across Denver, opening fresh lines of credit under Nathan's newly acquired portfolio. Delivery trucks navigated the canyon road daily, unloading velvet sectionals, imported Italian marble tables, and crystal chandeliers that clashed terribly with the rustic, eco-friendly aesthetic. Eugene embraced his unearned retirement with renewed vigor. He purchased top-tier golf clubs and premium cigars, treating the outdoor terrace like a private resort lounge. He sat in the sun, smoking and scrolling through his phone, entirely oblivious to the predatory lenders searching for his son. Caitlin drove her new luxury SUV up the mountain to join the housewarming festivities. She posted a live stream from the kitchen, holding a fluted glass and thanking her brother for always providing for the family. The audacity of her broadcast provided excellent entertainment. She walked through the hallways, pointing out the custom finishes and praising Nathan's business acumen. She did not realize the roof over her head was currently owned by unregulated loan sharks. Nathan mirrored his parents' gluttony. He returned to the city and signed paperwork for a second sports car, leveraging the perceived equity of the Delaware holding company he now legally controlled. He strutted into exclusive country clubs, tossing keys onto mahogany bars, playing the role of a tech visionary who just cashed out a lucrative merger. He treated the estate like an infinite cash dispenser, drawing upon phantom equity to fund a hollow existence. None of them comprehended the lethal mathematics working against them in the dark. The mezzanine loan Nathan hid during our marriage carried a 25% compounding interest rate. Every single day he spent browsing custom upholstery or sipping premium scotch, that toxic debt multiplied. The syndicate lenders did not care about his velvet couches or his leased vehicles. They cared about the principal, and the meter was running at terrifying speed. 40 miles below their canyon delusion, I stood in the center of my new residence. I had signed a lease on a sleek, modern penthouse in the heart of downtown Denver. The walls were painted a stark, clean white. The furnishings were sparse, functional, and elegant. I did not require crystal chandeliers to validate my worth. The panoramic windows overlooked the bustling financial district, forming a grid of concrete and glass where real power traded hands every millisecond. I poured a single measure of Japanese whiskey into a tumbler, enjoying the quiet clink of the ice sphere against the crystal. I walked toward my home office, seeking the dedicated room housing a custom server rack and 3 curved monitors. I sat in the ergonomic chair, waking the screens from their sleep mode. I bypassed the standard desktop interface, logging directly into my encrypted network. A digital dashboard filled the center monitor, displaying a synchronized countdown clock. The glowing red numbers ticked downward with merciless precision. 5 days, 16 hours, and 42 minutes. That was the exact moment the next interest payment for the syndicate loan became due. By demanding the holding company during the mediation, Nathan cemented his fate. The settlement contract he eagerly signed explicitly transferred all known and unknown liabilities into his custody. He insulated me from the fallout, acting as the perfect shield against his own creditors. The private equity enforcers hunting for his kneecaps now had a legally binding document pointing directly to the Canyon estate. He had planted a giant neon target on his own back. I took a slow sip of the whiskey, letting the smooth burn coat my throat. I felt a profound sense of liberation. The heavy burden of subsidizing their parasitic existence was finally gone. The quiet solitude of the penthouse served as a reward for my meticulous planning. I did not have to listen to Eugene complain about his golf handicap or watch Valerie judge my wardrobe. I was surrounded by the crisp hum of servers processing real wealth. I was not mourning the loss of the eco-estate. The solar arrays and geothermal pumps were merely physical objects. True wealth is liquidity and leverage. I possessed both. My offshore entity held high seven figures in clean, untraceable capital. The syndicate holding Nathan's debt operated on fear and fast returns. They loathed protracted legal battles involving residential foreclosures. If a debtor missed a payment, they preferred liquidating the toxic paper for a fraction of its value, rather than dragging a deadbeat through the court system for years. Nathan's financial illiteracy was a predictable variable. He poured his remaining liquid cash into the down payments for the new vehicles and the interior decorators. He lacked the capital to satisfy the looming syndicate invoice. When that deadline hit zero, the acceleration clause would trigger. The lender would demand the entire $1.2 million principal instantly. The panic would set in. He would scramble, calling his sleazy attorney, attempting to leverage the house to pay the debt. He would discover that his fresh lines of credit had frozen, and the walls were closing in around his fabricated empire. I typed a command into my terminal, initiating a secure communication protocol. I reached out to a trusted, distressed debt broker located in Manhattan. He was a shark in a tailored suit, ready to broker anonymous corporate acquisitions. I needed to position myself as the buyer of Nathan's impending default. I sent my proxy the parameters of the shadow ledger and the details of the syndicate holding the note. I instructed him to prepare a lowball cash offer for the toxic debt portfolio. The in-laws thought they had won the ultimate victory. They thought they had left me with nothing. They were currently sleeping soundly, dreaming of their stolen wealth, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic financial avalanche hovering directly above their heads. The math was flawless. The destruction was guaranteed. The moment Nathan missed his payment, we would strike. The sunrise bled over the Denver skyline, casting sharp geometric shadows across my penthouse walls. I sat in my ergonomic chair, staring at the glowing monitors of my command center. The digital countdown clock I had coded the previous night ticked away in the upper corner of the screen. Shadow lenders operating in the unregulated corners of private equity possess a distinct psychology. They are apex predators who thrive on fast returns and exorbitant interest rates. They despise messy, protracted legal battles. When a debtor begins a downward spiral, these syndicates prefer to cut their losses rather than risk an empty collection effort. If I allowed the current syndicate to issue the default notice, Nathan would inevitably panic. His sleazy divorce lawyer would advise him to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. That specific legal maneuver would place an automatic stay on all collection efforts, dragging the foreclosure process out for years inside a gridlocked court system. I could not allow Nathan to find a loophole. I needed to control the timeline, the acceleration clause, and the ultimate execution of the debt. To achieve that level of systemic reversal, I had to become the very monster he owed money to. I initiated a secure encrypted voice over Internet protocol call to a proxy located in Manhattan. Elias Thorne was a veteran distressed debt broker. He built his lucrative career navigating the murky waters of high-risk corporate liquidations. We had collaborated on several intense risk assessment profiles during my early years in the renewable energy sector. Elias specialized in buying toxic financial paper for pennies on the dollar, acting as an invisible shield for anonymous buyers. Elias answered on the first ring, his voice a low, gravelly hum that projected quiet authority. "Good morning, Joanna," he greeted, skipping any hollow pleasantries. "I reviewed the portfolio you sent over last night. The syndicate holding the paper is an outfit called Ironclad Capital. They issued a $1.2 million mezzanine loan to your ex-husband." "They are holding a ticking time bomb," Elias, I replied, keeping my tone crisp and detached. "Nathan is a reckless gambler who just acquired a high-altitude property by signing a blanket assumption of liabilities. He has zero liquid cash to cover the next interest payment. When he defaults, Ironclad Capital will face a multi-state foreclosure nightmare." Elias chuckled, a dry sound echoing through my headset. Ironclad hates residential collateral. They prefer seizing corporate bank accounts. Trying to evict an entitled family from a Colorado eco-estate is not their preferred business model. Offer them an exit, I instructed, staring at the ticking clock on my screen. I am utilizing my Delaware holding company as a blind purchaser. Offer Ironclad $500,000 in immediate, untraceable cash. The fierce negotiation commenced 20 minutes later. I remained on a muted line, listening intently as Elias engaged the senior partners at Ironclad Capital. The executives began the call posturing with fierce arrogance. They claimed the $1.2 million debt was secured by premium real estate, insisting they would easily recoup their investment. Elias systematically dismantled their confidence. He possessed a terrifying talent for highlighting every single vulnerability in a financial portfolio. He informed the executives that the debtor was an unemployed fraudster currently embroiled in a volatile divorce proceeding. He casually mentioned that Nathan forged signatures on the initial loan applications, an act that could entangle the collateral in severe legal disputes. If you try to collect from this man, you will spend the next 3 years paying litigators to fight over a forged deed, Elias warned him. His voice smooth and persuasive. My client is a private entity willing to assume that headache today. We are offering $500,000 in clean liquid funds. You clear a toxic asset off your books before the quarterly audit, and you walk away without the stain of a messy residential eviction. The line fell silent as the Ironclad executives muted their microphones to confer. I held my breath, feeling my pulse throb steadily against my wrists. This was the precise moment the entire operation hinged upon. If they demanded the full principal, my carefully constructed snare would face a significant hurdle. I gripped the edge of my desk, waiting for the verdict. The lead executive unmuted his line. His tone had lost its previous bravado, replaced by the weary resignation of a banker eager to mitigate a bad investment. We accept the $500,000, he conceded. Send the transfer protocols. A sharp thrill raced down my spine. The boulder had been successfully pushed over the edge of the cliff. I switched screens, opening the secure banking portal for my anonymous Delaware limited liability company. The account held the bulk of my performance bonuses, representing years of grueling analytical work. I initiated the wire transfer, typing the exact routing coordinates provided by Ironclad Capital. I verified the numeric sequence and clicked the authorization button. A loading bar appeared on the center monitor. It filled slowly, inching toward completion. Then a bright green confirmation box flashed across the screen, illuminating my face in the darkened office. The funds had cleared. Elias confirmed the receipt of the assigned debt schedules, terminating the call shortly after. I was now the sole legal proprietor of the $1.2 million syndicate loan. I downloaded the encrypted files containing the original loan agreements. Opening the documents, I scrutinized the exact covenants Nathan had signed. My eyes scanned the collateral annex, confirming the extent of his betrayal. He had pledged the Colorado estate, utilizing the corrupt notary to spoof my signature. But he had not stopped there. He needed substantial backing to satisfy the syndicate. He had also pledged his parents' longtime family home, forging Valerie and Eugene's signatures to secure the remaining balance. The sheer audacity of his crime was breathtaking. He had willingly offered up the roof over his own parents' heads to finance his sports betting addiction. And because he proudly signed the unconditional assumption of liabilities clause during our mediation, he legally validated every single forged document. He claimed responsibility for the entire toxic structure, effectively waiving his right to contest the fraudulent signatures in court. I leaned back in my chair, letting the magnitude of my acquisition wash over me. Joanna Sullivan was no longer a discarded wife facing social ruin. I was the primary secured creditor, holding the execution orders for 2 separate properties. I possessed the undeniable legal right to foreclose on the very people who had sought to destroy my livelihood. Miles away in the crisp mountain air, Nathan was likely pouring another glass of expensive champagne. He was parading around the cedar deck, bragging to his internet followers about his newly acquired wealth. He was leasing luxury vehicles and ordering imported furniture, blindly assuming the role of a tech visionary. Valerie was probably busy rearranging the living room, dictating commands to delivery workers, while Eugene smoked premium cigars on the patio. They believed they were the untouchable monarchs of an alpine empire. They felt incredibly secure within those vaulted timber walls. They had no conception that the floorboards beneath their feet no longer belonged to them. The deed to the mountain sanctuary and the title to the original family home were currently resting securely on my hard drive. I owned the very ground they walked upon. The digital clock on my monitor continued its steady descent. The first of the month was rapidly approaching. In a matter of days, the exorbitant $40,000 monthly interest payment would become due. Nathan spent his remaining liquid cash hosting a lavish housewarming party. He possessed zero incoming revenue to satisfy the invoice. When that payment inevitably bounced, the ruthless acceleration clause embedded in the loan would trigger automatically. The entire $1.2 million principal would become payable instantly. Nathan would receive a default notice, expecting to negotiate with faceless bankers. He would try to charm his way out of the crisis, relying on the same manipulative tactics he used his entire life. He had no idea that the anonymous creditor preparing to collect the debt was the exact woman he had thrown to the wolves. The snare was pulled taut. The countdown to their ultimate financial slaughter had officially begun. The first day of the month arrived with a heavy blanket of gray clouds pressing down on the Denver skyline. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, holding a mug of black coffee. My dual monitors glowed brightly in the dim room, displaying the secure ledger of Apex Holdings. The digital clock in the corner of my screen struck noon. The standard grace period for the syndicate loan officially expired. Nathan was required to remit a $40,000 interest payment to keep his toxic debt afloat. I monitored the incoming routing channels all morning. The ledger remained glaringly empty. He had drained his limited liquidity, hosting his lavish housewarming party, purchasing imported furniture, and leasing new sports cars. He possessed zero incoming capital. He treated the loan like a distant, abstract concept, assuming his newly acquired real estate equity would somehow shield him from the consequences of his reckless gambling. I sat down at my terminal and initiated the default sequence. The beauty of corporate debt lies in its emotionless execution. There are no arguments or tearful negotiations. It is pure, unyielding mathematics. I compiled the digital demand letter, invoking the strict acceleration clause embedded within the original contract. Because the monthly interest remained unpaid, the entire $1.2 million principal became due instantly. I attached the legal deeds to the Colorado Eco Estate and his parents' original home, highlighting the forfeiture covenants. With a single keystroke, I dispatched the encrypted email to Nathan. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, watching the digital delivery receipt populate on my screen. The snare was pulled tight. The precision of corporate law removed human sentiment from the equation, leaving only binding contracts and inevitable consequences. Nathan believed his status as a husband entitled him to my wealth, viewing my assets as a communal trough. By executing this default, I was teaching him the fundamental rule of high finance: leverage always demands a toll. While the email navigated the server nodes, another consequence of my severed financial lifeline was unfolding across town. Back when I first discovered Nathan draining my savings, I canceled the automatic payments for the luxury SUV he bought for his sister Caitlin. Without my steady income covering the exorbitant monthly premiums, the auto loan had quietly slipped into severe delinquency. Banks, unlike family members, do not accept empty excuses. Caitlin was currently finishing a late brunch at an exclusive suburban country club. The gray clouds had broken open, unleashing a torrential downpour over the manicured golf courses. She stood beneath the grand awning of the clubhouse entrance, wearing pristine white designer trousers and a silk blouse. She chatted loudly with a group of affluent women she desperately wanted to impress, holding a leather handbag over her head to shield her blowout from the damp air. She expected the valet to bring her gleaming SUV to the curb. Instead, a battered industrial tow truck backed into the circular driveway. The heavy diesel engine rumbled loudly, drowning out the polite chatter of the country club patrons. The hydraulic lift hissed as a burly repossession agent in a neon rain jacket secured thick steel chains to the front axle of Caitlin's vehicle. She froze, dropping her leather handbag onto the wet pavement. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. She sprinted out from beneath the awning, ignoring the freezing rain soaking through her expensive silk blouse. She screamed at the tow driver, demanding he unhook her car, insisting there must be a clerical error. Her shrill voice echoed across the parking lot, drawing the attention of every wealthy patron standing near the clubhouse doors. The repossession agent did not flinch. He calmly produced a clipboard shielded by a plastic cover, displaying the delinquent loan documents. He pointed to the highlighted sections indicating 3 consecutive months of non-payment. Caitlin lunged toward the driver's side door, attempting to physically block the winch mechanism. The agent simply stepped between her and the vehicle, holding up his hand in a firm gesture of dismissal. He instructed her in a bored monotone to step away from the truck, clarifying that the vehicle was now bank property. Caitlin frantically dialed her brother, expecting him to fix the humiliation, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The tow driver engaged the winch, hoisting the front tires of the SUV off the asphalt. Her friends, the very women she had cultivated to elevate her social status, began pulling out their phones. They did not step off the dry curb to help her. They recorded her humiliation, capturing the exact moment the towing cradle lifted her prestige into the air. The harsh reality of her unearned lifestyle was broadcast for everyone to witness. She stood in the pouring rain, her white trousers clinging to her shivering legs, as mascara ran down her cheeks in dark streaks. The status symbol she flaunted for weeks was dragged down the country club driveway, leaving her stranded and exposed. The unearned privilege she enjoyed on my dime vanished in a cloud of diesel exhaust. Miles above the rainy suburbs, the weather at the Alpine estate remained clear and crisp. Nathan sat on the expansive cedar deck, lounging in a custom teak chair. He wore designer sunglasses and sipped a craft cocktail, feeling like the undisputed king of his high-altitude fortress. He surveyed the jagged mountain peaks, congratulating himself on a flawless victory. He believed he had outsmarted a naive wife and secured a lifetime of effortless luxury. A sharp, automated ding resonated from the cell phone resting on the glass patio table. Nathan casually picked up the device, expecting a notification about a furniture delivery or a social media update. He opened the email bearing the unfamiliar sender name, Apex Holdings. He skimmed the first paragraph, his casual demeanor faltering. He pulled down his sunglasses, squinting at the harsh legal terminology. The crisp mountain breeze felt like ice against his skin. His breath hitched in his throat. He reread the text, searching for a typographical error or a sign that this was an elaborate phishing scam. The language was too precise, deeply embedded with specific routing numbers and deed coordinates. The email explicitly stated that the holding company he acquired during the divorce mediation was in severe default. The creditor demanded an immediate wire transfer of $1.2 million to satisfy the accelerated principal of the shadow loan. The final paragraph delivered the lethal blow. If the funds were not received within 30 days, the creditor would execute the primary liens, seizing the Colorado property and the longtime family home belonging to Eugene and Valerie. The cocktail slipped from his grasp, shattering against the cedar decking. The expensive liquor pooled around his shoes, but he did not notice. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. His heart hammered a frantic, erratic rhythm against his ribs. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The anonymous syndicate holding his gambling debts had found him. They knew exactly where he lived, and they held the legal right to render his entire family homeless. Panic consumed him. His hands shook so intensely he could barely unlock his screen. He dialed Lawson, his sleazy divorce attorney, pacing the length of the deck with short, frantic steps. Lawson answered with a weary sigh, asking what he wanted while preparing for another trial. "They are calling the debt," Nathan choked out, his voice high and thin. "Ironclad Capital must have sold the paper. Some company called Apex Holdings just sent a default notice. They want $1.2 million today, or they are taking this house and my parents' home. You have to fix this, Lawson. File an injunction. Tell the judge I was tricked." A heavy silence stretched across the line. The seasoned attorney processed the frantic demand, recognizing the inescapable reality of the situation. "I cannot file an injunction," Nathan Lawson replied, his tone stripped of its usual theatrical bravado. "What do you mean you cannot file an injunction?" Nathan yelled, gripping the wooden railing of the deck. "You are my lawyer. Do your job. Claim she committed fraud. Claim I did not know about the liens." You cannot claim ignorance, Lawson stated firmly. Did you read the final settlement contract you demanded to sign at the mediation? You explicitly insisted on total ownership of that corporate entity. You forced my hand during the negotiations. Your mother insisted you sign the document without allowing me to conduct a forensic audit. You chose speed over due diligence. To secure that ownership, you signed a clause titled, "Assumption of all known and unknown liabilities." Nathan stopped pacing. The memory of the boardroom flashed through his mind. He remembered his mother urging him to sign. He remembered mocking his seemingly defeated wife as she pushed the pen toward him. That clause was an ironclad waiver. Lawson continued delivering the crushing legal truth. By signing it, you explicitly agreed to take on every single debt attached to that entity, regardless of when it originated or whether you knew about it. You waived your right to contest the validity of those debts in court. You legally volunteered to become the sole guarantor of that toxic loan. If they take this house, my parents lose their home too, Nathan hyperventilated, his vision blurring. They used my father's signature on the cross-collateral paperwork. Then you better find $1.2 million in the next 30 days, Lawson advised coldly, because I cannot fight a contract you eagerly signed in front of a mediator. You demanded the castle, Nathan. You do not get to complain that the walls are caving in. You own the debt. You have zero legal recourse. Pay the money or start packing. The line went dead. Nathan lowered the phone, staring blankly at the breathtaking mountain vista that now represented his impending doom. The illusion of his victory evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying, undeniable ruin. He had willingly clamped the shackles around his own ankles, and the anonymous creditor held the only key. The realization of impending ruin stripped Nathan of his remaining pride. Standing on the cedar deck of the Canyon estate, he gripped his phone with trembling fingers and dialed his attorney. Lawson answered with a weary sigh, expecting another trivial complaint. Instead, he heard a frantic, breathless demand. Nathan begged the lawyer to contact the anonymous creditor to plead for a delay, to offer any concession necessary to halt the seizure of their homes. Lawson utilized formal legal channels, dispatching an urgent email to the corporate address listed on the default notice. The message requested an emergency mediation session, proposing to restructure the toxic debt to avoid immediate foreclosure on the residential properties. In Manhattan, Elias Thorne received the request. Following my precise instructions, Elias adopted the persona of an impatient, distressed debt broker. He replied with a brief, sterile email. He accepted the meeting, stipulating it must occur in person at a neutral, high-end law firm in downtown Denver the very next morning. He offered zero promises regarding a payment plan, letting the silence in his brief message breed terror. The day of the mediation dawned with bright, unforgiving sunlight. The chosen venue occupied the 42nd floor of a premier financial high-rise. The lobby featured polished obsidian floors and minimalist leather seating designed to make ordinary people feel profoundly small. The building catered to billionaires and multinational conglomerates, projecting an aura of vast, untouchable wealth. Nathan arrived flanked by his parents. The drive down the mountain had been a tense, silent ordeal. The transformation in their posture was stark. Just a week prior, Valerie and Eugene strutted through the canyon sanctuary as conquerors, commanding delivery workers and sipping premium wine. Today, they resembled cornered prey. Valerie wore a subdued beige trench coat, her usual vibrant silk scarves conspicuously absent. She clutched a handbag tightly against her chest, her knuckles white from the strain. Eugene trailed behind his shoulders, slumped, the newly purchased golf clubs forgotten in the trunk of a leased vehicle he could no longer afford. A silent receptionist escorted them into a sprawling, glass-walled boardroom overlooking the city. The space was intimidating, featuring a large frosted glass conference table and high-backed ergonomic chairs. Lawson sat at the far end, organizing his sparse defense notes. The lawyer offered no reassuring smiles. He knew his clients held zero leverage. Nathan took a seat near the center of the table. He wore the same custom-tailored suit he previously paraded around the country club, but the fabric now seemed to hang loosely on his frame. A thin sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead. He rested his arms on the table, trying to project a steady demeanor. He desperately needed to appear solvent to convince these unknown corporate bankers that his phantom startup would eventually generate capital. The physical manifestation of his panic betrayed him. Around his left wrist, he wore an exorbitant chronograph watch, a recent purchase funded by the perceived equity of his stolen home. His hand shook with such intense rhythmic frequency that the heavy metal clasp tapped against the glass table. Clink, clink, clink. The sound echoed in the quiet room, measuring the fragile seconds before their execution. Valerie hissed at him, urging him to hide his anxiety. She patted her perfectly styled hair, attempting to maintain a facade of upper-class dignity. Nathan simply lowered his hands to his lap, staring blankly at the frosted glass. They were waiting for a team of ruthless New York bankers. They expected men in sharp suits who viewed their lives as entries on a spreadsheet. They mentally prepared to beg strangers for mercy, hoping to save their homes by leveraging whatever pity they could extract. Outside the boardroom, I stood in the plush, carpeted hallway. My attorney, Victoria, stood beside me, holding a sleek black briefcase. The time for deception had expired. The weeping, broken widow they evicted had ceased to exist. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the familiar surge of analytical focus that always preceded a major corporate liquidation. I adjusted the cuffs of my blazer. I did not wear the faded gray sweater or the cheap denim jeans that marked my departure from the Alpine estate. I wore a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal suit constructed from Italian wool. The cut was precise, engineered to project flawless authority. The dark fabric highlighted my rigid posture. My chin remained elevated, my gaze sharp and unyielding. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, I did not see a victim. I saw the senior risk analyst who orchestrated a flawless systemic trap. Victoria reached for the heavy chrome handle. We did not knock. We did not ask for permission to enter the space. The double doors of the boardroom clicked, signaling the arrival of the apex predator. Nathan held his breath, his eyes fixed on the threshold. Valerie straightened her spine, preparing her most compelling victim narrative. Eugene swallowed hard, bracing for the financial impact. The doors swung inward, revealing the bright hallway lights. No team of Wall Street executives walked through the frame. No anonymous debt brokers carrying briefcases entered the room. I stepped across the threshold. My heels struck the obsidian floor with a sharp, definitive rhythm. Victoria flanked me, her own steps echoing in perfect unison. We moved with synchronized purpose, approaching the head of the conference table. The ambient hum of the city traffic below seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of our approach. The air evacuated the room. The sheer, paralyzing shock radiating from the opposing side of the table was a tangible force. Nathan stared at me. His mouth opened, forming a silent, shallow breath. The realization struck his features, rendering his face a canvas of pure horror. The anonymous creditor, the phantom entity demanding $1 million ransom, was the exact woman he bullied, manipulated, and discarded. His eyes darted to Victoria, then back to my tailored suit, trying to comprehend the catastrophic shift in the power dynamic. He looked at the briefcase Victoria set upon the table, recognizing the same lawyer who had seemingly surrendered just days prior. Valerie dropped her handbag. The expensive leather hit the floor, spilling cosmetics and keys across the carpet. She raised a shaking hand to her throat, her eyes wide and unblinking. The arrogant matriarch who gleefully ordered my clothes thrown onto the wet grass suddenly understood the identity of her executioner. Her curated reality fractured, revealing the terrifying truth that she had spent her entire life underestimating my intelligence. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords refused to cooperate. Eugene slumped back in his chair, his face draining of color. The leisurely retirement he funded with my quiet labor was over. He looked at his son, realizing Nathan was not a visionary entrepreneur, but a foolish gambler who handed their executioner the loaded weapon. The undeniable weight of their impending homelessness settled heavily upon his slumped shoulders. Lawson stood up, his seasoned legal mind rapidly processing the ambush. He looked at Victoria, recognizing her from the divorce mediation. He connected the dots, understanding that the Helpless Wife Act was a brilliant tactical diversion. The sleazy attorney realized he had walked his clients directly into a financial slaughterhouse. He closed his sparse defense folder, knowing that no legal maneuvering could save them now. I did not offer a greeting. I did not smile. I reached the head of the table and placed my hands flat upon the frosted glass, mirroring the predatory stance I utilized when dismantling toxic corporate structures. I looked directly into Nathan's eyes, watching the last remnants of his unearned pride evaporate into the sterile air of the boardroom. The stage was perfectly set. The trap had closed. The perpetrators of the digital smear campaign, the architects of my attempted ruin, now sat trapped in a glass box, waiting for my verdict. Their fate rested entirely in the hands of the woman they deemed weak. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, setting the foundation for the ultimate reckoning. The true cost of their entitlement was about to be laid bare. I stood at the head of the polished glass conference table, looking down at the very people who had spent the last month trying to erase my existence. The silence inside the Denver law office felt thick enough to suffocate them. The panoramic windows displayed the sprawling skyline, a grid of concrete and steel where true power operated. Nathan gripped the edge of the frosted surface so hard his knuckles turned stark white against his pale skin. He tried to form a coherent sentence, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single sound. His sleazy lawyer, Lawson, stared at the floor, realizing his entire legal defense had just evaporated into thin air. Valerie sat frozen in her plush, ergonomic chair. The smug, triumphant sneer she wore moments ago dissolved into a mask of pure terror. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest, as if the expensive leather could somehow shield her from the incoming catastrophe. Eugene shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between his son and the briefcase my attorney carried. They had arrived expecting a team of anonymous New York bankers. They expected to leverage pity and negotiate a comfortable payment plan. Finding the ex-wife they bullied standing in the role of the apex predator short-circuited their collective reality. Victoria did not rush. She unclasped her sleek silver briefcase with practiced precision. She extracted a stack of crisp legal documents bound in thick blue folders. I reached out, taking the heavy stack and dropping it directly onto the center of the table. The sound echoed like a judge bringing down a final gavel. "These are formal foreclosure notices," I announced, my voice steady and measured. Nathan flinched as if the paper itself radiated heat. He looked from the documents to my tailored suit, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between the weeping widow he evicted and the corporate liquidator standing before him. "You cannot be the anonymous creditor," he stammered, his voice thin and fragile. "The private equity syndicate owned that debt." "They owned it until I bought it," I corrected him, smoothing the lapels of my blazer. Shadow lenders despise messy residential collections. They loathe drawn-out court battles. I knew your lawyer would advise you to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy the second you received a default notice. A bankruptcy judge would have frozen the collection efforts, wrapping the debt in years of bureaucratic red tape. I refuse to let you manipulate the legal system to stall your inevitable failure. I stepped around the corner of the table, moving closer to where he sat. So I utilized my offshore limited liability company to act as a faceless, distressed debt buyer. My proxy offered the syndicate $500,000 in immediate clean cash. They were thrilled to wash their hands of a defaulting gambler. I purchased your toxic $1.2 million portfolio for pennies on the dollar. I now control the acceleration clause, and you formally signed the assumption of liabilities contract during our mediation. You waived every right to contest this collection. Nathan shook his head, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. "This is entrapment," he choked out. "You set me up, Joanna. You planned this just to steal the house back." I let out a dry, hollow laugh. "I did not force you to incur a seven-figure debt, Nathan. I performed a forensic audit on your hidden hard drives after you tried to sabotage my career. I cracked your shadow ledger. I know exactly where the money went." I turned my gaze toward Valerie and Eugene, who sat paralyzed in their seats. "Your son was not building a tech startup," I informed them, projecting my voice so every syllable resonated with unmistakable clarity. "He was running an illegal sports betting ring that hemorrhaged cash. When his bookies demanded payment, he sought an emergency injection from unregulated loan sharks. But he did not just gamble on sports." I looked back at Nathan, my eyes narrowing with pristine focus. "You borrowed syndicate money to short the stock of my own renewable energy firm? You actively bet against my career, predicting my company would fail after the quarterly earnings report. You intended to use my professional downfall to fund your unearned ego. You wanted to see me lose my job so you could pretend to be the wealthy savior." Lawson closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. The attorney recognized the sheer depth of his client deception. He shifted his chair away from Nathan, silently severing his professional association with a sinking ship. But unregulated loan sharks do not lend seven figures based on a smile, I continued, picking up the top folder and sliding it across the glass toward Valerie. They demand hard, tangible collateral. Nathan did not own any assets. He needed pristine real estate to secure the loan. Valerie looked down at the open folder, her hands trembling as she read the highlighted text. He utilized a corrupt digital notary within his gambling circle, I explained, tracking her reaction. He needed the digital footprint to look legitimate. He spoofed our internet protocol addresses to bypass the security protocols on the loan application. He forged my signature to pledge the Alpine estate. Then he drove to your apartment, logged onto your wireless network, and forged both of your signatures to pledge your longtime family home as secondary collateral. The air rushed out of Valerie's lungs in a ragged, horrifying gasp. She stared at the digital certificates and the false signatures stamped at the bottom of the page. The illusion of her golden child fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. She realized this was no longer a dispute over her son taking a house from an ex-wife. Her son had secretly handed the deed to her own home to dangerous underground creditors. "You pledged our house," Valerie whispered, her voice shaking with raw disbelief. She looked at Nathan, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "You forged our names to cover your gambling debts." "Mom, I can explain," Nathan pleaded, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of defense. "I was going to pay it back. The stock short was supposed to double my money. I just needed a few weeks to restructure the capital." Valerie did not wait for the rest of his excuse. The matriarchal facade she spent decades curating shattered into pure feral panic. She let out a piercing screech that bounced off the glass walls. She lunged across the armrest of her ergonomic chair, striking Nathan fiercely on the shoulder with her open palm. She hit him again and again, her designer handbag sliding off her wrist and crashing to the floor. "You ruined us," Valerie shrieked, her face twisted in anguish. "You gave them our home. Where are we supposed to live, Nathan? We have no savings. We have no pensions. You stole our roof." Eugene sat paralyzed, clutching his chest as he watched his wife attack their son. The leisurely retirement he enjoyed on my dime was evaporating before his eyes. He looked pale and fragile, a man realizing he was about to face the twilight of his life, living on the street. The golf clubs and the premium cigars he purchased on credit felt like profound insults against his impending poverty. Nathan shielded his face from his mother's blows, shrinking down in his expensive suit. He turned away from her, slipping entirely out of his chair. He hit the carpet hard. The arrogance that defined him for years evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. He crawled forward on the floor, stopping at the tips of my leather heels. The color was entirely absent from his face. His skin looked like damp parchment. He clasped his hands together, looking up at me from his knees. "Joanna, please," he begged, tears spilling over his lower eyelids and tracking through the sweat on his cheeks. "I am so sorry. I lost my mind. I will do anything. I will get a job. I will work night and day to pay you back. Just give me a payment plan. Please do not take my parents home. Do not throw us on the street. I am begging you for mercy." I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet. I searched my chest for a flicker of pity or a remnant of the affection I once held for him. I found nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I was a risk analyst, examining a neutralized threat. "Mercy," I echoed, my tone flat and unyielding. "You demand mercy after you launched a digital smear campaign to humiliate me? You demand mercy after you sent fabricated embezzlement documents to my Human Resources Department, hoping to send me to federal prison. You stood on the deck of my sanctuary, sipping champagne and laughing, while you thought I was starving in the cold." I stepped back, removing my shoes from his desperate reach. "You have exactly 30 days, I declared, dictating my terms with pristine clarity. "You owe Apex Holdings $1.2 million. Wire the funds in full to my corporate holding account. If the transfer does not clear by noon on the 30th day, my attorneys will execute the foreclosure orders. The sheriffs will arrive at both properties, they will change the locks, and they will physically remove you from the premises." Nathan stayed on his knees, weeping softly into his hands. Valerie continued to sob in her chair, berating her son through her tears. Lawson packed his briefcase in grim silence, eager to distance himself from the toxic wreckage of the family he represented. I turned to Victoria, offering a brief nod. She gathered her empty folders, and we walked together toward the heavy boardroom doors. I did not look back at the chaos erupting around the frosted glass table. I stepped out into the quiet, plush hallway, leaving them to tear each other apart in the glass cage they built themselves. The reckoning was delivered. The timer had started, and the bill was finally due. The 30-day grace period evaporated with the unforgiving speed of a plummeting stock chart. I tracked the incoming routing channels from my sleek downtown penthouse, watching the digital ledger remain stubbornly empty. Nathan scrambled to salvage his ruined position, attempting to liquidate the luxury sports cars he had recently leased, only to discover the early termination penalties eclipsed any potential financial return. He dialed former associates, begging for emergency bridge loans, while pitching his phantom startup as collateral. His peers, having witnessed the viral fallout of the digital smear campaign, ignored his desperate pleas. The social isolation his mother engineered to destroy my reputation became the exact barrier preventing his rescue. The clock struck noon on the 30th day. 0 incoming transfers registered on the corporate holding portal. The silence of the digital interface signaled the end of his prolonged delusion. I picked up my phone and authorized Victoria to release the final execution orders. The machinery of justice engaged with precise, emotionless efficiency. By early the next morning, county sheriffs deployed to both properties. I received real-time updates from the civil process servers, ensuring every legal protocol was strictly followed. At the Canyon Sanctuary, law enforcement officers knocked on the solid oak door. Nathan answered, wearing a crumpled dress shirt, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. The officers handed him the eviction mandate, granting him 10 minutes to gather his personal effects. He walked out of the architectural masterpiece, carrying the same single duffel bag I used when I abandoned the Denver rental. He left the high-altitude air and walked down the gravel path, stripped of his unearned kingdom. A simultaneous operation occurred at the longtime family home. Eugene and Valerie watched helplessly as moving crews changed the brass locks on their front door. Decades of curated affluence dissolved on their front lawn. They lacked the credit score and the liquid cash to secure a standard lease in a respectable neighborhood. Their only viable option was a dilapidated complex situated on the industrial outskirts of the city. 3 years prior, during a rare, honest conversation about our household budget, I had suggested that very same complex as a practical downsizing measure for them. Valerie had laughed in my face, calling the stucco buildings a pathetic trap for uneducated failures. She boasted that her refined pedigree elevated her above such pedestrian squalor. Now the matriarch who paraded around country clubs navigated cracked concrete walkways stained with engine oil. She dragged heavy trash bags full of her remaining designer clothes up 3 flights of rusted metal stairs. Her new reality consisted of flickering fluorescent hallway lights, peeling paint, and the constant roar of passing freight trains. The pristine social media narrative she curated to isolate me was replaced by the crushing anonymity of urban poverty. She had engineered her own exile, banishing herself to the very concrete box she once mocked with such profound arrogance. Nathan faced consequences far more severe than losing his shelter. The federal authorities do not overlook electronic forgery used to secure 7-figure loans across state lines. Agents from the Financial Crimes Division built a robust indictment using the digital forensics I provided to the court. They traced his spoofed internet protocol addresses and verified the fraudulent digital signatures stamped on the syndicate loan documents. Law enforcement intercepted him leaving a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of town. The charges included multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and securing credit through deceptive means. The federal prosecutor offered zero leniency. The scale of the deception, coupled with his willingness to pledge his own parents' home to cover illicit betting debts, painted a portrait of an unredeemable predator. The judge denied bail, citing his history of manipulating electronic records as a severe flight risk. He swapped his tailored suits for a standard-issue uniform, trading the soaring timber ceilings of the off-grid estate for the concrete walls of a federal penitentiary. His fake startup was permanently dissolved, replacing his entrepreneurial dreams with a mandated inmate identification number. While the architects of my attempted ruin faced the harsh geometry of their prison cells, my professional trajectory soared. The executive board at the renewable energy firm reviewed the meticulous forensic audit I conducted to clear my name. They recognized the razor-sharp precision required to trace the spoofed emails and dismantle the shadow ledgers. The chief executive officer called me into the corner office, offering a profound apology for the brief administrative leave. He slid a new contract across the polished mahogany desk. I walked out of the room holding the title of Director of Risk Management, accompanied by a substantial equity stake in the corporation. I had spent years analyzing structural weaknesses for a modest salary. I now commanded the entire division tasked with steering the company away from the very toxic assets I knew how to destroy. With my career ascending, I initiated the final phase of the extraction. As the primary secured creditor, I possessed the legal authority to reclaim the canyon sanctuary. I drove up the winding mountain pass, the tires gripping the familiar asphalt. The crisp air rushed through the open windows, smelling of pine and untainted freedom. I arrived at the heavy iron gates using a newly installed biometric scanner to grant myself entry. The interior of the house bore the scars of the short-lived reign of my in-laws. Clashing velvet couches and gaudy crystal fixtures disrupted the sustainable, eco-friendly aesthetic. I hired a specialized architectural restoration crew. They arrived within the hour, hauling the leased furniture out the front door. They stripped away the imported marble tables and the garish decorations, leaving only the raw natural timber and the sweeping panoramic views. They sanitized the space, purging the lingering scent of floral perfume and cheap cigar smoke. The sanctuary was restored to its original pristine condition. The sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting long golden shadows across the frost-covered timber deck. I stepped outside, breathing in the profound silence. The isolation felt restorative rather than lonely. I walked over to the cedar railing, carrying a sleek leather tote bag. I reached into the bag, bypassing the standard office supplies and the legal folders. My fingers wrapped around the cold, familiar handles of the heavy titanium kitchen shears. This was the exact same tool I utilized weeks ago to sever the joint credit cards and cut off the financial life support of my parasitic in-laws. The shears carried the weight of my initial liberation. I withdrew a bottle of vintage champagne from the tote. A thick silk ribbon sealed the gold foil around the cork. I raised the titanium shears, placing the sharp blade against the fabric. The metallic snap echoed in the quiet canyon air, severing the ribbon with clean, undeniable finality. I popped the cork, letting the pressurized foam spill onto the cedar deck. I poured the pale golden liquid into a crystal flute, raising the glass toward the darkening sky. The trap was empty. The predators were vanquished. The quiet victory required no audience. The golden liquid in the crystal flute caught the fading amber light of the setting sun. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The effervescence danced across my palate, carrying the sharp, crisp notes of a vintage harvest. The wind rushed through the deep river canyons below, sweeping upward to deliver the clean, untainted scent of pine needles and undisturbed snow. This was the pristine silence of the high-altitude alpine air. It was not the heavy, anxious quiet that used to blanket my cramped downtown Denver apartment when I waited for my ex-husband to return from his phantom networking events. This silence was earned. It was the sound of a neutralized threat. The psychological war I just won required more endurance than any corporate restructuring I ever managed. Society conditions women to function as endless reservoirs of forgiveness and financial support. We are taught that marital contracts and shared history obligate us to endure parasitism. For 4 years, I played the role of the diligent foundation. I paid the leases. I funded the illusions. I allowed people who despised my work ethic to reap the rewards of my 80-hour weeks. I bought into the fallacy that loyalty meant subsidizing the entitlement of others. I walked along the edge of the cedar deck, watching the sun dip behind the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The sky transitioned from a brilliant orange into deep, bruised shades of indigo and violet. The transition mirrored my own evolution. When I first discovered the transaction for the luxury sports utility vehicle, I did not feel sorrow. I felt the profound clarity that only arrives when a long-standing illusion shatters. In my profession, a risk analyst must detach emotion from the ledger. When a structure exhibits fatal rot, you do not paint the walls, you bring in the wrecking ball. Nathan and his parents viewed my quiet nature as submission. They perceived my financial provisions as a right rather than a privilege. When I severed their supply line, they responded with a digital smear campaign designed to force my compliance. They attempted to weaponize public opinion, hoping the resulting shame would drive me back into their grasp. They believed social pressure could override cold, hard mathematics. Their hubris was their defining flaw. They assumed they were hunting a frightened runaway wife. They failed to recognize they were stepping into an arena engineered by an apex predator. I took another sip of champagne, letting the chill of the glass ground me in the present moment. True power does not announce itself with arrogant boasts or flashy leased vehicles. True power operates in the shadows. It is the quiet, unyielding enforcement of personal boundaries. It is the understanding that your competence is your greatest shield. When Nathan tried to sabotage my career with fabricated embezzlement documents, he attacked the very armor that kept me safe. He learned the hard way that an independent woman possessing high-level forensic skills and unrestricted access to her own capital is an unstoppable force. Bloodlines and marriage certificates are merely biological accidents and legal formalities. They do not constitute a family. True family requires mutual respect, reciprocal effort, and an unwavering commitment to shared growth. Valerie and Eugene viewed our union as a commercial enterprise designed to fund their unearned retirement. They happily traded my stability for their own comfort. By isolating me from my former social circle through their online fabrications, they unintentionally handed me the greatest gift imaginable. They cleared the board. They removed the false friends and the superficial allies, leaving me with a pristine foundation to rebuild my life on my own terms. The foreclosure of their homes and the federal indictment waiting for Nathan were not acts of cruel vengeance. They were the natural, inevitable consequences of a bad debt calling its marker. I did not force him to gamble. I did not compel him to forge signatures on syndicate loans or bet against my corporate success. I simply removed the safety net he had grown so accustomed to exploiting. When gravity took hold, he plummeted at his own terminal velocity. I merely owned the ground he crashed upon. A standard risk model evaluates the likelihood of an adverse event against the potential impact of its occurrence. In the corporate sector, we use these models to protect investor capital. We install fail-safes, we build firewalls, we demand collateral. Yet in our personal lives, we routinely ignore the most basic tenets of risk mitigation. We hand our trust to people who demonstrate zero fiscal responsibility. We excuse toxic behavior under the guise of familial obligation. We allow emotional manipulation to bypass our internal security protocols. I spent years patching the leaks in my own household, balancing the budget while my ex-husband drilled new holes in the hull. The moment I applied my professional methodology to my private life, the solution became undeniably clear. The transition required ruthless discipline. It demanded the willingness to endure temporary public humiliation. Sitting in that mediation room, wearing a faded gray sweater and pretending to be a broken victim, tested every ounce of my restraint. Listening to the smug, patronizing tone of his divorce attorney required a level of stoicism I did not know I possessed. But the payout justified the performance. Handing a drowning man an anvil is a strategic masterpiece only if you can convince him the anvil is made of gold. Nathan snatched the heavy burden with greedy, eager hands. Now he sits in a concrete holding cell awaiting a federal judge. His parents navigate the grim reality of a decaying apartment complex, stripped of the status symbols they worshipped. The vehicles are repossessed, the credit lines are frozen, the illusion is dead. I stand on the deck of a property I own free and clear, holding a crystal flute filled with victory. The contrast is staggering, but it is profoundly fair. The scales of justice rarely balance themselves. Sometimes you have to place your thumb on the ledger and force the mathematics to align. If you find yourself trapped in a dynamic where your effort is taken for granted and your boundaries are continuously breached, you must recognize the inherent danger of your position. Do not wait for the parasitic elements to develop empathy. Parasites lack the capacity for gratitude. You must become the architect of your own extraction. Gather your resources in silence. Build your hidden fortresses. Let the people who underestimate you remain comfortable in their ignorance. When the time is right, you execute your exit strategy with cold, unyielding precision. You do not owe anyone your sanity, your savings, or your future. I finished the last drop of champagne. The sky was now a canvas of deep black dotted with the fierce, brilliant light of a million stars unhindered by city pollution. The wind howled through the canyon, a wild, untamed sound that echoed my own internal freedom. I turned away from the railing and walked back inside my impenetrable sanctuary. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the cold and securing the warmth of a life built entirely on my own terms. The wind sweeping through the deep river canyons of the Rocky Mountains carries a profound, untamed silence. Standing on the cedar deck of my off-grid sanctuary, I often look out over the jagged alpine peaks and reflect on the wreckage left behind in Denver. The dust has settled, the foreclosures are finalized, and the federal indictments are sealed. Yet, beneath the intricate layers of corporate liquidations and toxic debt, the true tragedy of my ex-husband's downfall is not one of financial ruin. It is a tragedy of generational decay. It is a cautionary tale about the catastrophic consequences of hollow parenting. When we examine the ashes of Nathan's life, we do not find the sudden, unpredictable mistakes of a desperate man. We find the inevitable harvest of seeds planted decades ago by Valerie and Eugene. In American culture, we romanticize the concept of the traditional family structure. We are conditioned to believe that a parent's ultimate duty is to shield their children from hardship, to elevate them, and to provide a life free from the friction of adversity. We mistake the removal of obstacles for the presence of love. But unconditional love and unconditional enabling are entirely different entities. Valerie and Eugene believed they were exceptional parents because they cultivated an impenetrable aura of upper-class dignity. They hosted the right brunches, drove the right cars, and constantly praised their visionary son to anyone who would listen. However, they failed to instill the foundational pillars of genuine human development: honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. Instead of teaching Nathan the intrinsic value of hard labor and accountability, they taught him that optics were a valid substitute for ethics. They taught him that as long as the surface looked polished, the rotting wood beneath did not matter. When you raise a child in an environment devoid of consequence, you do not create a confident adult. You engineer a predator. Nathan grew up believing the world owed him a limitless runway. When his phantom startup generated zero revenue, his parents did not sit him down for a difficult, honest conversation about finding stable employment. Instead, they gladly allowed my income to subsidize his illusions and their own unearned retirement. They viewed my 80-hour work weeks not with gratitude, but as an expected utility designed to keep their golden child comfortable. This dynamic exposes a severe crisis in modern family responsibility. True parenting requires the courage to let your children fail. It demands the fortitude to stand by and watch them endure the painful, necessary gravity of their own mistakes. When a child falls, the instinct is to rush in and soften the blow. But if you pad every surface, they never learn how to brace for impact. They never develop the emotional resilience required to navigate a society that does not care about their curated social media profiles. By perpetually shielding Nathan and his sister Caitlin from the harsh realities of financial and moral accountability, Valerie and Eugene sealed their own doom. The luxury SUV repossessed in the pouring rain, the federal wire fraud charges, the forged signatures that ultimately cost the parents their longtime home. These were not anomalies. They were the direct result of a family culture that prioritized entitlement over integrity. Nathan did not hesitate to leverage his parents' roof to cover his illegal gambling debts because he was raised to believe he was the center of their universe. He assumed they would absorb his collateral damage, just as they always had. As a spouse entering that family, I became the collateral damage of their parenting failure. It is a terrifying realization to understand that the person you married possesses no moral compass, simply because no one ever took the time to calibrate it for him. We spend years trying to fix our partners, attempting to untangle the deep-rooted entitlements instilled by their upbringing. We pour our resources, our sanity, and our youth into patching the leaks in their character. But a spouse cannot build a foundation that parents neglected to pour. The collapse of their empire was swift and merciless, but it was profoundly fair. Watching Valerie drag her belongings up the rusted metal stairs of a decaying apartment complex is a sobering reminder that the universe eventually balances its ledgers. You cannot sustain a legacy on a deficit of character. The wealth they sought to protect vanished because they forgot to cultivate the most important asset of all, a grounded, honest human being. If this reflection resonates with the quiet battles you fight in your own life, or if you are navigating the complex, often treacherous waters of raising grounded children in an entitled world, I invite you to join our community. Share your journey in the comments below. Let us know how you enforce accountability in your own family. And be sure to subscribe to Sarah Told Stories for more deep, unflinching narratives about survival, justice, and the hidden truths behind closed doors. We are frequently told that blood is thicker than water. We are commanded to forgive the unforgivable under the banner of family loyalty, adhering to a conventional wisdom that dictates we must sacrifice our own peace to keep the familial ship afloat. I reject that notion entirely. The greatest cruelty a parent can inflict is shielding a child from the weight of their own choices. When you remove the burden of accountability, you strip away their humanity, leaving behind a hollow shell incapable of surviving the real world. We must stop confusing self-sacrifice with virtue. Enabling toxic behavior is not an act of love, it is an act of cowardice. As the wind continues to howl through the alpine canyons, leaving the night sky vast and unblemished, a quiet truth settles over the remaining silence. When the roof eventually caves in on the life you have meticulously curated, you must ask yourself a terrifying question. Did a sudden storm destroy your house, or did you simply forget to pour the foundation?